The year 1895 brought with it the kind of suffocating heat that seemed to press down on Charleston, South Carolina like a wet blanket, trapping the scents of magnolia blossoms and salt air from the nearby harbor in a thick, languid embrace. It was into this world of contradictions, where genteel Southern charm masked the brutal realities of life for Black Americans in the post Reconstruction South, that Ellsworth Raymond Johnson would be born on October 31st, 1905. The modest wooden house where he entered the world stood in one of Charleston's colored neighborhoods, its weathered clapboard citing a testament to the economic struggles that defined life for most African American families in the early 20th century. The structure leaned slightly to one side, as if weary from bearing witness to the daily hardships of its inhabitants. Inside, the air hung heavy with the mingled aromas of cornbread cooling on a wooden table and the lingering smoke from a coal-burning stove that served as both cooking surface and the only source of warmth during Charleston's brief but penetrating winters. Ellsworth's mother, Margaret Johnson, was a woman whose hands told the story of her life more eloquently than words ever could. Calloused from years of washing clothes for white families across town, her fingers bore the permanent stains of lye soap and the rough texture that came from endless hours spent scrubbing other people's garments clean. She had learned early that survival required both physical endurance and an almost supernatural ability to navigate the complex social hierarchies that governed every interaction between black and white citizens in the Jim Crow South. His father, William Johnson, worked whatever jobs he could find in a society that seemed determined to limit his opportunities at every turn. Some days he loaded cotton bales at the docks, his back straining under weights that would have challenged men half his age. Other days he found work as a handyman, repairing the steps and shutters of houses he would never be invited to enter through the front door. The uncertainty of employment was a constant shadow hanging over the Johnson household, creating an atmosphere where every penny was precious and every meal was a small victory against the specter of hunger. The Charleston of Ellsworth's early childhood was a city caught between its antebellum past and an uncertain future. Grand mansions with their elegant wrought iron balconies still lined the historic streets, their gardens blooming with camellias and jasmine, while just blocks away, families like the Johnsons lived in neighborhoods where unpaved roads turned to mud with every rainfall and where the luxury of running water remained an impossible dream. The contrast was stark and deliberate, a physical manifestation of the social order that kept black families firmly in their designated place. In these early years, young Ellsworth learned lessons that would shape his understanding of power, respect, and survival. He watched his father's shoulders sag slightly each evening as he returned from another day of back-breaking labor, earning wages that barely covered the family's most basic needs. He observed his mother's careful deference when white customers came to collect their laundry, the way she lowered her eyes and softened her voice, transforming herself into the non-threatening figure that white society demanded she become. These observations were not lost on a boy whose intelligence was already becoming apparent to those who knew him well. Even as a small child, Ellsworth possessed an unusual ability to read people, to understand the unspoken dynamics that governed every social interaction. He noticed how his parents' behavior changed depending on who was present, how certain words and gestures could either diffuse tension or escalate it into something dangerous. The streets of Charleston provided an education that no schoolhouse could have offered. Here, young Ellsworth learned about territory and respect, about the subtle but crucial differences between various neighborhoods, and the invisible boundaries that governed them. He discovered that survival often depended on understanding who held real power and who merely appeared to hold it. These lessons came not from textbooks, but from careful observation of the complex social ecosystem that surrounded him daily. The church played a central role in the Johnson family's life, as it did for most African American families in the South during this era. Sunday mornings meant donning their best clothes, which were carefully maintained and preserved for these weekly occasions. The small Baptist church that the Johnsons attended was more than just a place of worship. It served as community center, social hub, and one of the few spaces where black citizens could speak freely without fear of reprisal from white authorities. It was in this church that Ellsworth first witnessed the kind of oratory that could move people to action, where preachers spoke not just of salvation in the next world, but of dignity and worth in this one. The rhythm and cadence of these sermons, the way words could be wielded like weapons or offered like healing balm, would leave a lasting impression on the young boy. He began to understand that language itself was a form of power, that the right words delivered at the right moment could accomplish things that force alone never could. As Ellsworth grew older, the limitations imposed by his circumstances became increasingly apparent. The schools available to black children in Charleston were poorly funded and inadequately equipped, staffed by teachers who did their best with resources that were deliberately kept minimal. Books were scarce and often outdated. Desks were shared among multiple students, and the school term was frequently shortened to accommodate the agricultural work that many families depended upon for survival. Despite these obstacles, Ellsworth proved to be an exceptional student when given the opportunity to learn. His teachers recognized in him a sharp intelligence and an unusual ability to grasp complex concepts quickly. However, they also noticed something else, something that would prove to be both a blessing and a curse throughout his life. The boy possessed an innate understanding of human nature, an ability to see through facades and identify people's true motivations with unsettling accuracy. This gift for reading people was accompanied by a growing restlessness, a sense that the narrow confines of his current life were insufficient to contain his ambitions. While other children his age seemed content to accept the limitations that society placed upon them, Ellsworth chafed against these restrictions. He began to ask questions that made adults uncomfortable, challenging assumptions that were supposed to remain unexamined. The economic realities of life in the rural South meant that formal education could only continue for so long. As Ellsworth entered his teenage years, the need for his contribution to the family's income became undeniable. He took on various jobs, each one providing new insights into the workings of Southern society. He worked in tobacco fields, where the wealthy landowners treated their black employees with the same casual disregard their ancestors had shown toward enslaved people. He ran errands for white-owned businesses in downtown Charleston, always careful to maintain the appropriate demeanor of deference and invisibility. These experiences reinforced lessons that Ellsworth had been learning since childhood about the nature of power and the ways it was exercised in American society. He saw how money could buy not just material comfort, but also social standing and protection from consequences. He observed how violence was used not just as a last resort, but as a tool of social control, employed to maintain existing hierarchies and discourage challenges to the established order. By the time Ellsworth reached his early teens, the Johnson family was facing the same difficult decision that confronted millions of African American families across the South during this period. The Great Migration had begun, and stories filtered back from friends and relatives who had ventured north, speaking of factory jobs that paid wages unimaginable in the rural South, of cities where a black man could walk down the street without automatically stepping aside for white passersby. The decision to leave Charleston was not made lightly. It meant abandoning the only home the family had ever known, leaving behind extended family and familiar surroundings for the uncertainty of life in a distant city. Yet the alternative was to remain trapped in a system that seemed designed to ensure that families like the Johnsons would never rise above their current circumstances. Margaret Johnson had heard from a cousin who had settled in New York City in a neighborhood called Harlem, where black families were creating their own businesses and cultural institutions. The letters described a place where opportunity existed for those brave enough to seize it, where the rigid social hierarchies of the South were replaced by different rules, rules that might favor someone with intelligence, ambition, and the willingness to take risks. As 1919 dawned, the Johnson family prepared for a journey that would forever alter the trajectory of young Ellsworth's life. They sold what few possessions had any value, keeping only the essentials needed for the long train ride north. The decision represented more than just a change of address. It was a leap of faith into an unknown future, guided by little more than hope and determination. The train that would carry them away from Charleston was segregated, of course, with black passengers relegated to cars that were invariably more crowded, less comfortable, and positioned closest to the engine, where smoke and cinders made the journey even more unpleasant. But for Ellsworth, gazing out the window as the familiar landscapes of his childhood gradually gave way to unfamiliar territory, the discomfort was forgotten in the excitement of anticipation. He was leaving behind the world that had shaped his early understanding of limitation and control, heading toward a city that represented possibility and danger in equal measure. The lessons learned in Charleston would prove invaluable in the years to come, providing him with insights into human nature and social dynamics that would serve him well in his future endeavors. But those early experiences had also instilled in him a deep understanding of how power operated in American society, knowledge that would eventually lead him down paths his family could never have imagined during those long days and nights aboard the northbound train. The train pulled into Pennsylvania Station on a gray March morning in 1919, its brakes releasing great clouds of steam that mixed with the breath of hundreds of passengers stepping onto the platform. For 14-year-old Ellsworth Johnson, the cacophony of sounds, the press of bodies, and the sheer overwhelming scale of New York City represented both liberation and bewilderment. The boy who had grown up in the measured rhythms of Charleston suddenly found himself in a metropolis that never seemed to pause for breath. Harlem in 1919 was experiencing the most dramatic transformation in its history. What had once been a predominantly white, middle-class neighborhood was rapidly becoming the cultural and intellectual capital of Black America. The Great Migration was in full swing, and every day brought new families from the South, each carrying their own dreams and desperate hopes for a better life. The streets pulsed with an energy that was both exhilarating and dangerous, where opportunity and peril walked hand in hand down every avenue. The Johnson family found temporary lodging in a cramped tenement apartment on West 135th Street. The building was a towering structure of red brick and fire escapes, its narrow hallways filled with the sounds and smells of dozens of families learning to live in closer proximity than they had ever experienced before. The walls were thin enough that conversations in one apartment became part of the daily soundtrack for everyone else, creating an involuntary intimacy among strangers who had been thrust together by circumstance. For Ellsworth, the adjustment to city life proved both challenging and illuminating. The rhythms he had known in Charleston, where seasons dictated the pace of work and social interactions, followed predictable patterns, were replaced by something far more complex and unpredictable. Here, fortunes could change in a single day, reputations could be made or destroyed by a single decision, and the rules that governed success were written in a language he was only beginning to learn. The streets themselves became his classroom. Lenox Avenue and 7th Avenue teemed with activity from dawn until deep into the night. Legitimate businesses operated alongside more questionable enterprises, often in the same buildings and sometimes run by the same people. Young Ellsworth learned to read the subtle signs that distinguished between different types of establishments, recognizing which storefronts were genuine and which served as fronts for activities that would never appear in any official records. It was during these early months in Harlem that Ellsworth first encountered the numbers game, a form of illegal gambling that would eventually become central to his life's work. The game itself was elegantly simple in concept, but remarkably sophisticated in execution. Players would place small bets on 3-digit numbers, hoping to match the winning combination that was typically derived from published financial figures or horse racing results. For many residents of Harlem, playing the numbers represented one of the few opportunities to transform their economic circumstances overnight. The young man, who would later become known as Bumpy Johnson, was already displaying the characteristics that would define his adult life. He possessed an unusual combination of street intelligence and analytical thinking, able to understand both the emotional appeals that drove people to gamble and the mathematical probabilities that ensured the house always maintained its advantage. More importantly, he began to grasp the social dynamics that made illegal gambling not just tolerated, but actively embraced by much of Harlem's population. His first foray into criminal activity came not from any grand ambition, but from the simple necessity of survival. The legitimate employment opportunities available to a black teenager in 1919 New York City were severely limited. Even when jobs could be found, they typically paid wages that were insufficient to support a family, leaving young men like Ellsworth with few options for contributing to their household's income through conventional means. It began with running numbers slips for established operators, a task that required reliability, discretion, and the ability to navigate Harlem's complex social geography without attracting unwanted attention from law enforcement. Ellsworth proved exceptionally skilled at this work, demonstrating an almost supernatural ability to remember complex betting combinations and customer preferences without ever committing anything to paper that might serve as evidence if he were caught. The work also provided him with an education in human nature that no formal schooling could have offered. He learned to read the subtle signs of financial desperation that drove people to bet money they could not afford to lose. He observed how hope could override rational calculation, leading otherwise sensible individuals to make decisions that defied logic. Most importantly, he began to understand how the promise of easy money could create powerful psychological dependencies that were often stronger than any physical addiction. As his reputation for reliability grew, Ellsworth found himself entrusted with increasingly important responsibilities. He was assigned to collect debts from players who had fallen behind in their payments, a task that required a delicate balance of persuasion and intimidation. Too gentle an approach would result in unpaid debts that could quickly spiral out of control. Too aggressive a response might drive away customers or attract the attention of law enforcement officers who preferred to maintain the fiction that illegal gambling did not exist in their precincts. It was during one of these collection visits that Ellsworth first resorted to violence as a means of resolving a business dispute. The details of the incident would later become part of Harlem folklore, though the exact truth was probably known only to those directly involved. What seems certain is that a customer who had refused to pay his gambling debts for several weeks made the mistake of treating the young collector with disrespect that crossed certain unspoken boundaries. The confrontation likely took place in one of Harlem's many pool halls, establishments that served as informal community centers where men gathered to discuss politics, business, and local gossip while engaging in games that were as much about social positioning as they were about entertainment. These venues operated under their own codes of conduct, where respect was earned through demonstrated competence and maintained through careful attention to social hierarchies. The customer, perhaps emboldened by the presence of friends or simply unaware of the young man's growing reputation, made comments that challenged Ellsworth's authority and, by extension, the credibility of his employers. In the world of illegal gambling, where trust and reputation were the only currencies that truly mattered, such challenges could not be ignored without consequences that extended far beyond the immediate situation. The response was swift, decisive, and calculated to send a message that would resonate throughout Harlem's gambling community. Ellsworth's actions demonstrated not just his willingness to use violence when necessary, but his understanding of how violence could be employed strategically to achieve specific objectives. The incident established his reputation as someone who could not be intimidated or dismissed, while also proving that he possessed the kind of controlled aggression that was essential for success in his chosen field. Word of the confrontation spread quickly through the informal networks that connected Harlem's various criminal enterprises. The story grew in the telling, as such stories always do, but the essential message remained consistent. The young man from Charleston had proven that he understood the rules of his new environment and was prepared to enforce them when circumstances required such action. This incident also marked the beginning of Ellsworth's transformation from a simple numbers runner into something approaching a criminal entrepreneur. He began to analyze the various illegal enterprises operating in Harlem, studying their methods and identifying their weaknesses. He observed how successful operators managed their territories, recruited reliable associates, and maintained the delicate relationships with law enforcement that allowed their businesses to function relatively undisturbed. The nickname that would stay with him for the rest of his life emerged during this period, though its exact origin remained a subject of debate among those who claim to remember its first usage. The most commonly accepted explanation involved the prominent bump on the back of his head, a physical characteristic that distinguished him from others and provided an easy means of identification in a community where many people shared similar names and backgrounds. Some suggested that the nickname carried deeper connotations, reflecting not just his physical appearance, but his willingness to bump up against established authority and challenge existing power structures. Others maintained that it simply represented the kind of casual naming conventions that were common in Harlem during this era, where colorful nicknames often replaced given names in daily usage. Regardless of its origins, the name Bumpy Johnson began to appear in the conversations of numbers operators, policy bankers, and other figures who made their living on the margins of legality The name carried with it certain expectations and associations, creating a reputation that would both open doors and create enemies as the young man continued his education in the complexities of criminal enterprise. By the end of 1920, Bumpy had established himself as a reliable and increasingly important figure in Harlem's numbers game. He had learned to navigate the intricate relationships between different criminal organizations, understanding when cooperation was beneficial and when competition was unavoidable. More importantly, he had begun to develop his own network of associates and customers, laying the foundation for what would eventually become his own criminal empire. The transition from Charleston farm boy to Harlem street operator had required fundamental changes in outlook and behavior. The deference and caution that had been necessary for survival in the Jim Crow South were replaced by a more assertive approach that acknowledged the different rules governing life in the urban North. Yet some essential characteristics remained constant, particularly his ability to read people accurately and his understanding of how power relationships functioned in complex social environments. As 1921 approached, Bumpy Johnson had completed his transformation from recent arrival to established presence in Harlem's criminal community. The lessons learned during his first years in New York City would serve him well in the challenges that lay ahead, providing him with both the practical skills and the psychological foundation necessary for the ambitious plans that were already beginning to form in his calculating mind. The winter of 1921 brought with it a harsh education that would shape Bumpy Johnson's understanding of criminal enterprise for the rest of his life. The bitter wind that swept down from the Hudson River seemed to carry with it lessons about power, loyalty, and the delicate balance between cooperation and competition that governed Harlem's underworld. In the cold months that followed his first taste of violence, Bumpy found himself drawn deeper into a world where success depended not just on courage or intelligence, but on the ability to navigate complex relationships with men who lived by codes that were never written down but were understood with absolute clarity. His first true mentor in the criminal arts was a man known throughout Harlem simply as Baltimore Red, a policy operator whose territory stretched from 125th Street to 140th Street along Lenox Avenue. Red had earned his nickname not from his origins, but from the reddish tinge of his hair, which had begun to gray at the temples by the time he took young Bumpy under his wing. He was a man of medium height and careful habits, who dressed well without ostentation and spoke softly while somehow commanding immediate attention from everyone in his presence. Baltimore Red had been operating in Harlem since 1915, long enough to have witnessed the neighborhood's transformation from a predominantly white enclave to the bustling heart of Black America. He understood the rhythms of the street in ways that came only from years of careful observation and hard-won experience. More importantly, he possessed the kind of institutional memory that allowed him to see patterns where others saw only random events. Under Red's guidance, Bumpy learned that successful criminal enterprise required the same attention to detail and careful planning that characterized any legitimate business. The numbers game might appear to be a simple matter of collecting bets and paying winners, but the reality was far more complex. Successful operators needed to understand cash flow management, risk assessment, personnel recruitment, and customer relations. They also needed to master the delicate art of maintaining productive relationships with law enforcement officials while avoiding the kind of high-profile incidents that might force those same officials to take unwanted action. The education began with mundane tasks that gradually revealed their deeper significance. Bumpy was assigned to maintain detailed records of betting patterns, tracking which numbers were played most frequently and by whom. This seemingly simple bookkeeping exercise taught him to identify the subtle trends that could make the difference between profit and loss. He learned that certain numbers were favored by specific communities, often based on cultural or religious significance, and that understanding these preferences allowed operators to adjust their odds accordingly. He also discovered that successful numbers running required an almost encyclopedic knowledge of human psychology. Regular customers developed recognizable patterns in their betting behavior, often influenced by personal events, seasonal changes, or community happenings. A skilled operator could predict with remarkable accuracy which numbers would be heavily played on any given day, allowing for strategic adjustments that protected the house's advantage while maintaining customer satisfaction. Baltimore Red also introduced Bumpy to the broader ecosystem of Harlem's illegal economy. The numbers game did not exist in isolation, but was connected to a network of other enterprises that included illegal liquor sales, unlicensed gambling establishments, and various forms of protection services. Understanding these connections was essential for anyone who hoped to advance beyond the level of a simple employee. The relationship between different criminal organizations was governed by unwritten agreements that had evolved over years of trial and error. Territorial boundaries were respected not because of any formal treaties, but because violations inevitably led to conflicts that were bad for everyone's business. Successful operators learn to identify opportunities for cooperation while remaining vigilant against potential betrayals. During the long evenings spent in Red's apartment above a legitimate barbershop on Lenox Avenue, Bumpy absorbed lessons about the importance of maintaining multiple income sources and diversified operations. Red explained that successful criminal enterprises needed to be resilient enough to survive periodic crackdowns by law enforcement, temporary disruptions caused by rival organizations, and the inevitable changes in customer preferences that occurred over time. These conversations often continued well into the night, accompanied by the distant sounds of Harlem's nightlife filtering up from the street below. The muffled music from nearby speakeasies, the laughter of couples walking home from evening entertainment, and the occasional rumble of late-night traffic created a soundtrack that seemed to underscore the lessons being shared in the dimly lit room above the barbershop. Red also taught Bumpy about the critical importance of information gathering and analysis. Successful criminal operators needed to maintain extensive networks of contacts who could provide advance warning of police raids, changes in political leadership, and shifts in the attitudes of community leaders who might influence public opinion. This intelligence gathering required careful cultivation of relationships with people from many different walks of life, from legitimate business owners to corrupt officials to rival criminal organizations. The young man proved to be an exceptional student of these complex subjects. His natural intelligence was enhanced by an unusual ability to remember names, faces, and personal details that allowed him to build the kind of extensive contact network that was essential for success in his chosen field. More importantly, he demonstrated an intuitive understanding of the psychological dynamics that governed relationships between different types of people. As 1922 progressed, Bumpy was gradually given more responsibility within Red's organization. He was assigned to recruit new customers, a task that required considerable diplomatic skill. Potential players needed to be approached with the right combination of enthusiasm and discretion, generating interest without creating the kind of public attention that might attract unwanted scrutiny from law enforcement or rival organizations. This work brought him into contact with a wide cross section of Harlem society, from domestic workers seeking to supplement their meager wages to successful business owners looking for additional excitement in their lives. Each group required a different approach, and Bumpy learned to adjust his manner and presentation to match the expectations and comfort levels of his diverse clientele. The recruitment process also taught him valuable lessons about trust and verification. Not everyone who expressed interest in playing the numbers was necessarily a legitimate customer. Some might be undercover police officers seeking evidence for future prosecutions. Others might be representatives of rival organizations attempting to gather intelligence about Red's operations. Learning to distinguish between genuine customers and potential threats became an essential survival skill. During this period, Bumpy also experienced his first serious encounter with law enforcement as a criminal suspect rather than merely a witness or bystander. The incident occurred during a routine police raid on a policy bank where he was working as a collector. Although he managed to avoid arrest by escaping through a back window, the experience provided him with valuable insights into police tactics and the importance of maintaining multiple escape routes from any location where illegal activities were taking place. The near miss also reinforced lessons about the importance of maintaining good relationships with attorneys who specialized in defending clients involved in illegal gambling cases. Red introduced Bumpy to several lawyers who had built their practices around representing numbers, operators, and their employees. These men understood the nuances of gambling law and had developed working relationships with prosecutors and judges that allowed them to negotiate favorable outcomes for their clients in many situations. As his education progressed, Bumpy began to identify areas where existing operations might be improved or expanded. He noticed that many policy banks were inefficiently organized, with unnecessarily complex hierarchies that slowed decision making and created opportunities for embezzlement. He also observed that customer service standards were often poor, with players treated as mere sources of revenue rather than valued clients whose satisfaction was essential for long term success. These observations led to conversations with Red about potential innovations that might give their organization competitive advantages over rival operators. Some of these discussions focused on operational improvements, such as faster payment of winnings or more convenient betting locations. Others addressed strategic questions about territorial expansion or the development of new services that might appeal to underserved customer segments. By the end of 1922, Bumpy had completed his basic education in the fundamental principles of criminal enterprise. He understood how successful illegal businesses were organized, financed, and protected. More importantly, he had begun to develop his own philosophy about the proper relationship between criminal organizations and the communities in which they operated. Unlike some operators who viewed their customers and neighbors with contempt or indifference, Bumpy was developing a more sophisticated understanding of the symbiotic relationship between illegal enterprises and community life. He recognized that successful criminal organizations needed to provide value to their communities, not just exploit them for short term profit. This insight would later become central to his approach as an independent operator. The foundation had been laid for the next phase of his criminal career. The lessons learned under Baltimore Red's tutelage had provided him with both the practical skills and the theoretical framework necessary for more ambitious undertakings. As 1923 approached, Bumpy Johnson was preparing to transform himself from student to practitioner, ready to test his accumulated knowledge against the harsh realities of independent criminal enterprise in one of America's most competitive illegal markets. The spring of 1925 brought with it a sense of possibility that seemed to permeate every corner of Harlem, from the flower vendors who appeared on street corners selling daffodils and tulips to the sound of jazz music that drifted from open windows as the weather grew warmer. For Bumpy Johnson, now 20 years old and seasoned by 2 years of working closely with Stephanie Street Clare, the changing season represented more than just relief from winter's harsh grip. It marked the beginning of his transformation from trusted lieutenant to independent operator, a metamorphosis that would require all the skills he had acquired during his apprenticeship in the complexities of criminal enterprise. The decision to establish his own organization had not been made lightly or suddenly. It had emerged gradually from a series of conversations with Stephanie that revealed her recognition of his growing capabilities and her understanding that talented subordinates eventually needed to chart their own courses. She had observed his success in handling increasingly complex negotiations and had noted his natural ability to inspire loyalty among the men who worked under his supervision. More importantly, she had recognized that his ambitions had grown beyond what her existing organization could accommodate. The arrangement they negotiated was both generous and practical, reflecting the mutual respect that had developed between mentor and student over their months of working together. Stephanie would provide initial financial backing and territorial concessions that would give Bumpy's new operation room to grow without directly competing with her established interests. In return, she would receive a percentage of his profits for the first 3 years of independent operation, along with his continued cooperation in matters that affected the broader criminal community of Harlem. The first challenge facing any aspiring criminal entrepreneur was the recruitment of reliable personnel, a task that required careful evaluation of character, competence, and loyalty. Bumpy understood that his success would depend ultimately on his ability to surround himself with men who shared his vision of professional criminal enterprise and who could be trusted to represent his interests even when he was not present to supervise their activities directly. His initial recruitment efforts focused on individuals he had observed during his years of working throughout Harlem's criminal community. He sought men who had demonstrated reliability in their current positions, but who might be ready for advancement opportunities that their present employers could not provide. The ideal candidates possessed street intelligence combined with personal discipline, along with a kind of controlled aggression that could be directed strategically rather than unleashed impulsively. One of his first and most important recruits was a man known throughout the neighborhood as Illinois Gordon, who had earned his nickname from his origins in Chicago before migrating to New York City during the great population movements of the early 1920s. Gordon possessed the rare combination of mathematical ability and street credibility that made him ideally suited for managing the detailed record keeping that successful numbers operations required. He understood probability calculations, could detect patterns in betting behavior, and had the personal presence necessary for collecting debts from reluctant customers. Another early addition to Bumpy's organization was a soft-spoken man named Willie the Rat, whose unfortunate nickname belied both his personal loyalty and his exceptional skills as an information gatherer. Willie had developed an extensive network of contacts throughout Harlem's legitimate and illegitimate business communities, enabling him to provide advance warning of police raids, changes in political sentiment, and the movements of rival criminal organizations. His contributions would prove invaluable in helping Bumpy's operation avoid many of the pitfalls that destroyed less well informed competitors. The process of building an effective organization required more than simply recruiting talented individuals. It demanded the creation of systems and procedures that could function efficiently even during periods of stress or rapid change. Bumpy applied lessons learned from observing Stephanie's operation, establishing clear hierarchies of authority and responsibility while maintaining enough flexibility to adapt to changing circumstances. He divided his territory into distinct geographical sections, each supervised by a trusted lieutenant who was responsible for all activities within his assigned area. These section leaders reported directly to Bumpy and were expected to maintain detailed knowledge of every numbers runner, collection point, and customer within their jurisdictions. This organizational structure created clear lines of communication while distributing operational responsibilities in ways that prevented any single point of failure from destroying the entire enterprise. The establishment of standard operating procedures proved particularly important for maintaining consistency and quality control across all aspects of the organization's activities. Bumpy instituted regular training sessions for new employees, ensuring that everyone understood not only their specific job responsibilities, but also the broader principles that guided the organization's approach to business. These sessions covered everything from proper techniques for handling customer complaints to protocols for dealing with law enforcement encounters. Customer relations received special attention in Bumpy's organizational philosophy, reflecting lessons he had absorbed from Stephanie about the importance of community support for long-term success. He established policies that emphasized prompt payment of winnings, fair treatment of complaints, and respectful interaction with all customers, regardless of their economic status or social position. These policies were enforced through a combination of regular supervision and financial incentives that rewarded employees for maintaining high customer satisfaction levels. The numbers game itself was organized with mathematical precision that would have impressed legitimate business analysts. Bumpy instituted systematic tracking of betting patterns, enabling his organization to identify trends that could be exploited for competitive advantage while avoiding exposure to catastrophic losses. He also developed relationships with multiple sources for the daily numbers that determined winning combinations, ensuring that his operation could continue functioning even if primary sources became unavailable. Financial management represented another area where Bumpy's organization distinguished itself from many competitors who operated on more informal bases. He established procedures for tracking revenues and expenses with the kind of detail that legitimate businesses used for tax preparation and investor relations. This attention to financial discipline enabled him to identify profitable and unprofitable activities quickly, while also providing the documentation necessary for managing relationships with suppliers, employees, and other business partners. The cultivation of political and law enforcement relationships required particularly delicate handling, as these connections provided essential protection while also creating potential vulnerabilities if not managed properly. Bumpy learned to navigate the complex expectations of corrupt officials who needed to maintain appearances of law enforcement while also benefiting from the financial arrangements that allowed illegal gambling to flourish. He developed systems for making regular payments that were substantial enough to ensure cooperation, but not so large as to create unwanted attention or unrealistic expectations for future increases. Community involvement represented a crucial element of Bumpy's organizational strategy, reflecting his understanding that successful criminal enterprises needed to provide value to their neighborhoods rather than simply extracting resources from them. He instituted policies of contributing to local churches, supporting community organizations, and providing assistance to families experiencing financial hardships. These activities created reservoirs of goodwill that proved invaluable during periods when external pressures threatened his operations' stability. The establishment of multiple legitimate business fronts provided both operational advantages and community credibility for Bumpy's growing organization. He acquired interests in several small retail establishments that served as meeting places and message centers, while also generating legitimate income that helped explain his improving lifestyle to curious observers. These businesses also provided employment opportunities for family members and associates who needed visible means of support. As his organization matured during the latter months of 1925, Bumpy began developing the kind of institutional culture that distinguished professional criminal enterprises from mere street gangs. He established codes of conduct that governed interactions between organization members and with outside parties, creating predictable behavioral expectations that enhanced operational efficiency while also building the organization's reputation for reliability and professionalism. The recruitment and training of additional personnel continued as the organization's territory and activities expanded throughout northern Harlem. Bumpy personally interviewed every potential employee, evaluating not only their technical qualifications, but also their compatibility with the organizational culture he was working to establish. He sought individuals who understood that their success was tied to the organization's success, creating alignment between personal ambitions and collective objectives. By the end of 1925, Bumpy Johnson had successfully established the foundation for what would become one of Harlem's most enduring and influential criminal organizations. His careful attention to organizational development, community relations, and professional standards had created an enterprise that commanded respect from competitors, customers, and law enforcement alike. The lessons learned during this formative period would serve him well as he faced the increasingly complex challenges that accompanied success in his chosen field. The stage was now set for the next phase of his criminal career, when the organization he had built would be tested by conflicts with rivals who viewed his success as a threat to their own interests. The solid foundation he had established through careful planning and systematic development would prove essential for surviving the challenges that lay ahead as Harlem's criminal community prepared for the territorial disputes and power struggles that would define the late 1920s. The winter of 1926 descended upon Harlem like a heavy curtain, bringing with it the kind of bone-deep cold that seemed to slow everything except the ambitions of men who had grown accustomed to taking what they wanted through force and cunning. The snow that accumulated in dirty piles along the curbs of Lenox Avenue and 7th Avenue created a muffled quality to the usual street sounds, as if the entire neighborhood was holding its breath in anticipation of the conflicts that experienced observers knew were inevitable when successful criminal enterprises began expanding into territories claimed by established competitors. Bumpy Johnson's organization had grown substantially during its first year of independent operation, attracting customers and generating revenues that had begun to draw unwanted attention from rival operators who viewed his success as a direct threat to their own interests. The numbers game in Harlem operated within a delicate ecosystem where territorial boundaries were respected through informal agreements that had evolved over years of trial and error. When those boundaries were challenged, either through deliberate expansion or accidental encroachment, the resulting conflicts often escalated into violence that could reshape the criminal landscape for years to come. The first serious challenge to Bumpy's growing influence came from an operator known throughout the neighborhood as Fat Sam Morrison, a man whose considerable physical bulk was matched by an equally substantial appetite for territorial expansion. Morrison had been running numbers in central Harlem since the early 1920s, building an organization that relied more on intimidation than on the kind of professional service that characterized Bumpy's approach to the business. His customers tolerated his operation primarily because they had few alternatives, while his employees remained loyal mainly through fear rather than genuine respect or shared ambition. Morrison's initial response to Bumpy's success had been to dismiss the younger man as a temporary inconvenience who would eventually be eliminated by the natural processes of criminal competition. However, as months passed and Bumpy's organization continued to attract customers who had previously been Morrison's exclusive domain, the older operator began to recognize that more direct action would be necessary to protect his interests. The conflict began with seemingly minor incidents that might have been dismissed as coincidences by less experienced observers. Numbers runners working for Bumpy's organization began reporting encounters with Morrison's men who questioned their presence in certain neighborhoods and suggested that they might be more comfortable conducting their business elsewhere. Collection points that had been serving Bumpy's customers for months suddenly became unavailable, with proprietors claiming that they could no longer afford to risk the complications that came with hosting illegal gambling activities. These early provocations were handled through diplomatic channels, with representatives from both organizations meeting in neutral locations to discuss the boundaries and expectations that governed their respective activities. Bumpy personally attended several of these sessions, demonstrating his commitment to resolving the dispute through negotiation, while also making clear that his organization would not be intimidated into abandoning territory that had been legitimately acquired through superior service and competitive pricing. However, Morrison apparently interpreted Bumpy's willingness to negotiate as evidence of weakness rather than strength. The older operator escalated his campaign of interference, instructing his employees to actively discourage potential customers from patronizing Bumpy's operation, while also spreading rumors about the younger man's reliability and financial stability. These tactics represented a significant miscalculation of both Bumpy's character and the loyalty he had cultivated among his employees and customers. The decisive confrontation occurred on a Thursday evening in late February, when Morrison made the fatal mistake of personally confronting Bumpy in the back room of a legitimate restaurant that served as one of several neutral meeting places for Harlem's criminal community. The establishment was owned by an elderly woman named Mother Johnson, who had earned universal respect through decades of providing good food and maintaining strict neutrality in the various disputes that periodically disrupted the neighborhood's criminal enterprises. Morrison arrived at the restaurant, accompanied by three of his most trusted enforcers, men whose reputations for violence were well established throughout Harlem's underworld. Their presence was intended to intimidate Bumpy into accepting a territorial arrangement that would have effectively confined his organization to a small section of northern Harlem, while leaving Morrison's more lucrative central territory undisturbed. The older operator had apparently convinced himself that a show of force would be sufficient to resolve the dispute in his favor without the need for actual violence. The confrontation that followed would become part of Harlem folklore, though the exact details were known only to those who were present in Mother Johnson's back room that evening. What seems certain is that Morrison seriously underestimated both Bumpy's personal courage and the loyalty of the men who worked for his organization. The meeting that was supposed to result in Bumpy's capitulation instead became the catalyst for Morrison's downfall as a major figure in Harlem's criminal community. The immediate aftermath of the confrontation saw Morrison's organization begin to disintegrate with remarkable speed. Several of his most important lieutenants quietly approached Bumpy's representatives to discuss the possibility of changing their allegiances, bringing with them detailed knowledge of Morrison's operations and access to his customer base. These defections were motivated partly by recognition of which way the wind was blowing, but also by genuine appreciation for the more professional approach that characterized Bumpy's management style. Within 2 weeks of the restaurant confrontation, Morrison's once formidable operation had been reduced to a shadow of its former self. His remaining loyal employees found themselves unable to compete effectively with Bumpy's organization, which offered better odds, more reliable service, and the kind of community respect that Morrison had never bothered to cultivate. The older operator's attempts to restore his position through increasingly desperate displays of violence only accelerated his organization's collapse by driving away customers who preferred to conduct their gambling activities in less volatile environments. The elimination of Morrison's organization provided Bumpy with valuable lessons about the psychology of criminal competition and the importance of timing in strategic decision making. He learned that successful confrontations required careful preparation and precise execution, with every aspect of the conflict planned in advance to minimize risks while maximizing the likelihood of achieving desired objectives. More importantly, he discovered that reputation could be a more powerful weapon than physical force when wielded skillfully against opponents who had made themselves vulnerable through poor judgment or inadequate preparation. The consolidation of Morrison's former territory required delicate handling to avoid creating the kind of resentment that could lead to future conflicts with other operators who might view Bumpy's rapid expansion as a threat to conflicts Bumpy as a threat to every BT, their own interests. Rather than simply absorbing Morrison's customers and employees wholesale, Bumpy took time to evaluate each situation individually, retaining those elements that could contribute positively to his organization while allowing others to find alternative arrangements that satisfied their needs and preferences. His approach to managing the expanded territory reflected lessons learned from observing Stephanie Street Clare's methods for maintaining control over diverse operations and personnel. He established new procedures for supervising activities in areas that had previously operated under different rules and expectations, while also implementing training programs that ensured consistency of service across his enlarged organization. The successful elimination of Morrison's competition also attracted attention from other criminal organizations throughout Harlem, some of which viewed Bumpy's growing influence with concern, while others saw potential opportunities for profitable cooperation. These reactions required careful navigation to avoid creating new conflicts while taking advantage of possibilities for mutually beneficial arrangements. One of the most significant challenges that emerged from the Morrison conflict was the need to manage relationships with law enforcement officials who had previously received payments from the eliminated organization. These officers needed to be approached with the right combination of respect and financial incentive to ensure their continued cooperation with illegal gambling activities in their jurisdictions. Bumpy assigned his most diplomatic representatives to handle these sensitive negotiations, understanding that maintaining good relationships with corrupt officials was essential for long term operational stability. The period following Morrison's elimination also provided opportunities for Bumpy to refine his organization's operational procedures and expand into new activities that complemented the core numbers business. He began offering protection services to legitimate businesses that operated in his territory, providing security against both criminal predation and unwanted interference from rival organizations. These services generated additional revenue while also strengthening his organization's relationship with the broader Harlem community. As spring arrived in 1927, Bumpy Johnson had established himself as one of the most influential criminal operators in northern and central Harlem. The successful elimination of Morrison's competition had demonstrated his organization's capabilities while also sending clear messages to other potential rivals about the consequences of challenging his growing influence. However, success also brought new responsibilities and new enemies as other criminal organizations began to reassess their own strategies in light of the changing balance of power in Harlem's illegal economy. The lessons learned during the Morrison conflict would prove invaluable in the challenges that lay ahead, as Bumpy's continued expansion brought him into contact with increasingly sophisticated opponents who represented threats that could not be eliminated through the relatively straightforward tactics that had proven sufficient against Fat Sam Morrison. The foundation had been laid for the next phase of his criminal career, when his organization would need to demonstrate its ability to compete not just with local rivals, but with criminal enterprises that possessed connections and resources extending far beyond the boundaries of Harlem itself. The summer of 1927 brought with it a heat that seemed to rise from the very pavement of Harlem's streets, creating shimmering mirages above the asphalt and driving residents to seek relief on fire escapes, rooftops, and in the relative coolness of basement establishments that served as informal community centers. For Bumpy Johnson, now firmly established as one of the most influential criminal operators in northern Manhattan, the sweltering months provided both opportunities and challenges as he contemplated the next phase of his organization's development. The success he had achieved through careful planning and strategic elimination of competitors had created a foundation solid enough to support ambitious expansion plans that would transform his operation from a regional numbers business into something approaching a criminal empire. The decision to diversify beyond the numbers game had been influenced by observations of other successful criminal enterprises, particularly those operated by Italian American families who had demonstrated the advantages of maintaining multiple revenue streams that could compensate for temporary disruptions in any single area of activity. Bumpy recognized that relying exclusively on illegal gambling, no matter how profitable, created vulnerabilities that could be exploited by law enforcement crackdowns or economic changes that affected his customer base. True security required building an organization capable of adapting to changing circumstances while maintaining consistent profitability across a range of different activities. His first major expansion into new territory involved the establishment of protection services for legitimate businesses operating within his sphere of influence. The concept was elegantly simple in its execution, building upon relationships he had already developed with store owners, restaurant proprietors, and other entrepreneurs who had benefited from the stability his organization brought to their neighborhoods. These businesses faced constant threats from street criminals, extortionists, and rival criminal organizations that viewed successful enterprises as targets for predatory activities. Bumpy's protection services offered a comprehensive solution that addressed multiple types of threats while providing genuine value to paying customers. His men would ensure that businesses remained free from robbery attempts, vandalism, and the kind of systematic harassment that could drive away customers and destroy carefully built reputations. The services also included mediation of disputes with suppliers, assistance in collecting debts from slow paying customers, and intervention in conflicts with other businesses that might escalate into situations requiring police involvement. The expansion into protection services required careful calibration of both pricing and service quality to ensure that customers felt they were receiving fair value while also generating sufficient profits to justify the investment of personnel and resources. Bumpy instituted systematic evaluation procedures that assessed the specific risks faced by individual businesses, allowing his organization to tailor protection packages that addressed particular vulnerabilities while avoiding unnecessary services that might inflate costs beyond what customers were willing to pay. The success of the protection business created opportunities for further diversification into areas that complemented existing activities while serving the same customer base. Many of the businesses that purchased protection services also required access to capital for expansion, inventory purchases, or equipment upgrades. Traditional banks were often unwilling to provide loans to small businesses in Harlem, particularly those owned by African American entrepreneurs who faced systematic discrimination in their attempts to access legitimate financial services. Bumpy recognized that providing private lending services could address a genuine community need while also generating substantial profits for his organization. He established procedures for evaluating loan applications that considered factors ignored by traditional lenders, such as community reputation, family stability, and demonstrated commitment to business success. Interest rates were set at levels that reflected the higher risks associated with unsecured loans, but they remained competitive with other available alternatives and were often more flexible in their repayment terms. The lending operation required sophisticated financial management systems that could track multiple loans simultaneously, while ensuring that payments were collected promptly and defaults were handled appropriately. Bumpy recruited personnel with experience in legitimate financial institutions, offering compensation packages that attracted qualified professionals who might otherwise have been employed by banks or investment companies. These employees brought with them knowledge of accounting procedures, risk assessment techniques, and collection strategies that enhance the operation's effectiveness and professionalism. Geographic expansion represented another major component of Bumpy's empire building strategy during this period. His success in northern and central Harlem had created a reputation that extended far beyond his original territory, attracting inquiries from criminal operators in other neighborhoods who sought partnerships or franchise arrangements that would allow them to benefit from his proven business methods. Rather than attempting to expand directly into every available territory, Bumpy developed a network of affiliated operations that maintained their independence while operating under his general guidance and protection. These affiliate relationships were structured to provide mutual benefits for all parties involved. Local operators gained access to Bumpy's expertise, financial resources, and protection from larger criminal organizations that might otherwise overwhelm their smaller enterprises. In return, Bumpy received percentages of their profits, along with strategic intelligence about criminal activities and law enforcement developments in neighborhoods throughout New York City. The arrangement also created buffer zones around his core territory, reducing the likelihood of direct challenges from rival organizations. The management of multiple affiliated operations required the development of communication systems that could coordinate activities across different neighborhoods while maintaining the security necessary for illegal enterprises. Bumpy established regular meeting schedules that brought together representatives from various operations to share information, resolve disputes, and coordinate responses to external threats. These meetings were rotated among different locations and conducted under strict security protocols that minimized the risk of law enforcement surveillance. The expansion into new activities and territories also necessitated significant upgrades to the organization's internal structure and personnel policies. Bumpy created specialized departments that focused on different aspects of the expanding operation, with experienced managers responsible for numbers operations, protection services, lending activities, and territorial coordination. This departmental structure improved operational efficiency while also providing career advancement opportunities that helped retain talented employees who might otherwise have been attracted to competing organizations. Training programs were established to ensure that employees in different departments understood not only their specific responsibilities, but also how their activities related to the organization's broader objectives. New recruits were required to complete comprehensive orientation programs that covered everything from customer service standards to security procedures, while experienced employees participated in ongoing education sessions that kept them informed about changes in business practices and external threats. The diversification of activities also required more sophisticated relationships with corrupt law enforcement officials and political figures who provided protection for illegal enterprises. Different types of criminal activities attracted attention from different agencies and officials, creating the need for a more complex web of relationships that could provide comprehensive protection across all aspects of the expanded operation. Bumpy assigned his most diplomatic representatives to manage these relationships, ensuring that payments were made consistently and that communication remained open even during periods of political change or law enforcement reorganization. Community relations became increasingly important as the organization's activities expanded and its influence grew throughout Harlem. Bumpy instituted systematic charitable giving programs that supported churches, schools, and social organizations that served the neighborhood's residents. These contributions created reservoirs of goodwill that proved valuable when the organization faced challenges from law enforcement agencies or rival criminal groups that lacked similar community support. The charitable activities were carefully planned to maximize their positive impact while avoiding the kind of ostentatious displays that might attract unwanted attention from federal investigators or journalists seeking sensational stories about criminal enterprises. Contributions were made anonymously or through intermediaries, with recipients understanding the source of the funds but maintaining discretion about their origins. By the autumn of 1928, Bumpy Johnson had successfully transformed his organization from a specialized numbers operation into a diversified criminal enterprise that generated revenue from multiple sources while maintaining strong relationships with both customers and community members. The expansion had required substantial investments of time, money, and personnel, but it had also created an organization that was more resilient and better positioned for continued growth than would have been possible through exclusive focus on any single type of criminal activity. The success of the expansion also created new challenges and responsibilities that would require continued attention and strategic planning. Larger organizations attracted more attention from law enforcement agencies, required more sophisticated management systems, and created more opportunities for internal conflicts that could undermine operational effectiveness. The foundation had been laid for continued growth, but maintaining that growth would require the same careful attention to detail and strategic thinking that had characterized the organization's development from its earliest days. As winter approached and Harlem prepared for another season of cold weather and reduced street activity, Bumpy Johnson could reflect with satisfaction on the empire he had built through intelligence, determination, and careful attention to the principles that governed successful criminal enterprise in one of America's most competitive illegal markets. The autumn of 1928 settled over New York City like a familiar embrace, bringing with it the crisp sense of burning leaves and the subtle changes in light that signaled the approaching end of another year. In the offices of Tammany Hall and the precinct houses scattered throughout Manhattan, the changing season marked more than just the passage of time. It represented the cyclical nature of political power and the delicate negotiations that determined how that power would be exercised in the months ahead. For Bumpy Johnson, whose criminal enterprise had grown to encompass significant portions of Harlem's illegal economy, the autumn months provided opportunities to strengthen and expand the network of corrupt relationships that protected his organization from unwanted interference by law enforcement agencies. The cultivation of these relationships required a sophisticated understanding of the complex motivations that drove men to compromise their official duties in exchange for financial gain or political advantage. Bumpy had learned through years of careful observation that successful corruption was rarely a simple matter of offering money in exchange for services. Instead, it involved building personal relationships based on mutual benefit and shared interest, creating bonds that could withstand the pressures of political change and law enforcement scrutiny. His approach to corrupting authority figures began with extensive research into the backgrounds, preferences, and vulnerabilities of potential targets. This intelligence gathering was conducted through a network of informants that included legitimate business owners, political activists, and even family members of the officials he hoped to influence. The information collected was used not for blackmail or coercion, but rather to identify approaches that would be most likely to succeed while minimizing the risk of exposure or betrayal. Police officers represented the most immediate and essential targets for corruption efforts, as their cooperation was necessary for the day-to-day operation of illegal gambling establishments and other criminal enterprises. However, not all officers were suitable candidates for corrupt relationships. Bumpy learned to identify those who were already predisposed to accept bribes, either through financial pressures created by personal circumstances or through demonstrated patterns of behavior that suggested flexible attitudes toward law enforcement duties. The initial approach to potentially corrupt officers was always conducted through intermediaries who could test their receptivity without exposing Bumpy's organization to unnecessary risks. These intermediaries were often legitimate business owners who maintained regular contact with police officers through their normal commercial activities. A restaurant owner might mention to a regular customer who happened to be a police officer that certain businesses in the neighborhood were experiencing fewer problems with criminal activity. A barbershop proprietor might suggest to an officer getting his hair cut that some local entrepreneurs were particularly grateful for police protection and occasionally express their appreciation in tangible ways. If these subtle approaches indicated potential interest, more direct contact would be established through carefully orchestrated meetings in neutral locations that provided plausible explanations for the encounters. A police officer might find himself seated next to one of Bumpy's representatives at a community meeting or church function where conversation could naturally turn to local conditions and mutual interests. These initial conversations never involved explicit offers of bribery, but rather explored common ground and established personal relationships that could be developed over time. The actual corruption process was typically gradual, beginning with small favors that could be easily rationalized as community service rather than criminal conspiracy. An officer might be asked to provide advance warning of planned raids on gambling establishments, presented as a way of preventing unnecessary violence that could endanger innocent bystanders. The information would be accompanied by modest payments that were described as tokens of appreciation rather than bribes for specific services. As relationships developed and trust was established, the scope of cooperation would gradually expand to include more significant services and correspondingly larger payments. Officers who had initially provided simple warnings about raids might eventually agree to alter patrol schedules to accommodate illegal activities or to ensure that arrests were conducted in ways that minimized disruption to ongoing criminal enterprises. The most valuable corrupt officers were those who could influence the actions of their colleagues, creating small networks of protection within individual precincts. The corruption of judicial officials required even more delicate handling, as judges and prosecutors operated within systems that provided greater oversight and created more severe consequences for detected misconduct. Bumpy's approach to these officials focused on identifying those who were already sympathetic to arguments about social justice and community needs. Many judges and prosecutors in New York City during the 1920s held progressive views about the enforcement of laws that disproportionately affected minority communities, creating opportunities for appeals based on fairness and social equity. These officials were approached not with crude offers of financial benefit, but with sophisticated arguments about the positive role that well managed criminal enterprises could play in community stability and economic development. The numbers game, for example, could be presented as a form of community banking that provided economic opportunities for residents who were excluded from legitimate financial institutions. Protection services could be described as private security arrangements that supplemented inadequate police coverage in underserved neighborhoods. When financial arrangements with judicial officials were established, they were typically structured as legitimate business transactions that could withstand casual scrutiny. A judge might be offered profitable investment opportunities in real estate ventures that were actually financed through criminal proceeds. A prosecutor might receive consulting fees for legal advice provided to legitimate businesses that served as fronts for illegal activities. These arrangements created plausible explanations for sudden improvements in the official's financial circumstances, while also establishing ongoing relationships that could be maintained over extended periods. Political figures represented perhaps the most complex and potentially valuable targets for corruption efforts, as their influence extended across multiple agencies and could provide protection that transcended individual law enforcement actions. However, politicians also operated within systems that created significant risks for those who accepted corrupt payments, making them both more cautious and more expensive to influence than police officers or judicial officials. Bumpy's approach to political corruption emphasized long term relationship building rather than immediate transactional arrangements. He began by identifying politicians whose public positions and voting records suggested sympathy for issues important to Harlem's African American community. These officials were then supported through legitimate political contributions and volunteer efforts that established his organization as valuable political allies rather than simple sources of illegal funding. The transformation from legitimate political support to corrupt relationship typically occurred gradually as politicians became dependent on the resources and organizational capabilities that Bumpy's network could provide. Campaign contributions might be supplemented by volunteer workers who could mobilize voters in crucial elections. Financial support might be enhanced by business opportunities that provided politicians with legitimate sources of additional income. These relationships created mutual dependencies that made it difficult for politicians to withdraw their support without risking significant political and financial losses. The most sophisticated corruption relationships involved creating networks of influence that spanned multiple levels of government and law enforcement. A corrupt police captain might provide information about planned raids to a corrupt judge, who could then arrange for delayed warrant approvals that gave criminal enterprises time to relocate their activities. A corrupt prosecutor might coordinate with a corrupt political figure to ensure that high profile arrests received minimal media attention or were scheduled to avoid interfering with important criminal operations. Maintaining these complex networks required constant attention to the personal and professional needs of corrupt officials. Bumpy assigned specific representatives to manage relationships with different categories of officials, ensuring that each corrupt contact received appropriate attention and that potential problems were identified and addressed before they could threaten the network's stability. These relationship managers were selected for their diplomatic skills and their ability to maintain confidential information under pressure. The financial costs of maintaining extensive corruption networks were substantial, often representing significant percentages of the organization's total revenues. However, Bumpy viewed these expenditures as essential investments in operational security rather than mere business expenses. The protection provided by corrupt officials allowed his organization to operate with minimal interference from law enforcement agencies, reducing risks and maximizing profits across all areas of criminal activity. The corruption networks also provided valuable intelligence about law enforcement activities and political developments that could affect criminal enterprises. Corrupt officials often provided advance warning of policy changes, personnel transfers, and investigative initiatives that might require adjustments to operational procedures or temporary suspension of certain activities. This intelligence allowed Bumpy's organization to adapt quickly to changing circumstances while maintaining continuous profitability. By the winter of 1929, Bumpy Johnson had established one of the most comprehensive corruption networks in New York City's history, with reliable contacts throughout the police department, judicial system, and political establishment. The network provided his criminal empire with unprecedented protection from law enforcement interference, while also creating opportunities for expansion into new territories and activities. However, the complexity and scope of these corrupt relationships also created new vulnerabilities and challenges that would require constant management and occasional dramatic intervention to maintain their effectiveness. The foundation had been laid for the next phase of his criminal career when the protection provided by corrupt officials would be tested by increasing pressure from federal law enforcement agencies and reform minded politicians who were less susceptible to traditional corruption approaches. The network he had built would prove essential for surviving these challenges, but it would also become a target for investigators seeking to dismantle his criminal empire through systematic exposure of official misconduct. The decade of the 1930s dawned over Harlem with a mixture of promise and foreboding that seemed to capture the contradictory nature of American life during those transformative years. The stock market crash of 1929 had sent shockwaves through the legitimate economy, creating widespread unemployment and financial hardship that paradoxically increased demand for the services provided by illegal enterprises like those operated by Bumpy Johnson. As legitimate opportunities became scarcer and traditional sources of credit disappeared, more residents of Harlem turned to the numbers game for hope of financial salvation, while businesses struggling to survive sought the protection and private lending services that his organization provided with reliable professionalism. By 1932, Bumpy had reached the apex of his power and influence in Harlem, controlling criminal enterprises that generated revenues comparable to many legitimate corporations while maintaining the kind of community respect typically reserved for elected officials or prominent business leaders. His daily routine reflected this unique position, beginning each morning in the elegantly appointed apartment he maintained on Sugar Hill, the prestigious neighborhood where Harlem's most successful residents lived in brownstone houses and luxury apartment buildings that rivaled those found in any white neighborhood in Manhattan. The apartment itself served as both residence and informal headquarters, decorated with fine furniture and artwork that reflected his appreciation for quality and refinement. The living room featured a mahogany dining table where he conducted business meetings, surrounded by leather chairs that provided comfortable seating for the steady stream of associates, community leaders, and legitimate business owners who sought his counsel and support. The walls were lined with bookshelves containing volumes on history, philosophy, and business management, evidence of his commitment to continuous self education and intellectual development. His morning routine typically began at 7:30 with a breakfast prepared by a housekeeper who had worked for the family for several years. Understanding his preferences for simple but well prepared meals that provided energy for the demanding day ahead. The newspapers delivered each morning provided essential intelligence about political developments, economic conditions, and law enforcement activities that might affect his operations, while also keeping him informed about broader social and cultural trends that influenced community attitudes and behavior. The transformation of Bumpy from street criminal to community leader was perhaps most evident in the respect he commanded from legitimate business owners and civic leaders throughout Harlem. Store proprietors who had initially viewed him with suspicion and fear now sought his advice on business matters and his assistance in resolving disputes that might otherwise have required expensive legal intervention. Church leaders, who had once condemned illegal gambling as morally destructive, now acknowledged the practical benefits that his organization brought to the community through employment opportunities, charitable contributions, and protection from more predatory criminal enterprises. His influence extended into virtually every aspect of community life, from the informal mediation of neighborhood disputes to the provision of financial assistance for families experiencing temporary hardships. When longtime residents faced eviction due to unemployment or medical expenses, they often turned to Bumpy for emergency loans that were provided at reasonable interest rates and with flexible repayment terms that recognized the economic realities facing working families during the Great Depression. When small business owners needed capital for inventory purchases or equipment repairs, his lending operation provided funding that was simply unavailable through legitimate financial institutions. The numbers operation that formed the foundation of his criminal empire had evolved into something approaching a community institution, providing daily excitement and hope for thousands of Harlem residents, while also serving as an informal communication network that connected different neighborhoods and social groups. The runners who collected bets and distributed winnings also carried news, gossip, and messages throughout the community, creating social connections that transcended traditional boundaries of class, age, and geographic location. His protection services had similarly evolved beyond simple crime prevention to encompass a broad range of community safety and security functions. His men not only deterred robberies and vandalism, but also mediated disputes between neighbors, provided escort services for elderly residents who felt unsafe walking alone at night, and maintained order at community events that might otherwise have been disrupted by outside troublemakers. These services were provided without fanfare or public recognition, but they contributed significantly to the general sense of safety and stability that characterized the neighborhoods under his influence. The management of this extensive operation required organizational skills that would have impressed executives at legitimate corporations. Bumpy maintained detailed records of all financial transactions, employee performance evaluations, and customer relationships that allowed him to identify trends, anticipate problems, and make strategic decisions based on comprehensive analysis rather than mere intuition. He employed accountants, attorneys, and business consultants who provided professional expertise while maintaining the discretion necessary for involvement in illegal enterprises. His daily schedule typically included meetings with department heads who managed different aspects of the organization, briefings on financial performance and operational challenges, and strategic planning sessions that addressed both short term tactical issues and long term growth opportunities. These meetings were conducted with the same formality and attention to detail that characterized board meetings at major corporations, reflecting his understanding that successful criminal enterprises required the same level of professional management as any other complex organization. The afternoon hours were often devoted to community engagement activities that reinforced his position as an informal civic leader, while also gathering intelligence about local conditions and concerns. He might visit legitimate businesses to discuss their needs and challenges, attend meetings of community organizations that addressed social issues affecting Harlem residents, or provide informal consultation to individuals seeking advice about personal or professional problems that required his particular expertise in navigating complex social and economic relationships. Evening activities frequently included attendance at cultural events that reflected Harlem's emergence as the center of African American intellectual and artistic life. He was a regular patron of the Cotton Club and other establishments that featured the jazz musicians and entertainers who were transforming American popular culture, while also supporting legitimate theaters and literary organizations that provided platforms for emerging African American talent. These activities served multiple purposes, providing personal enjoyment while also maintaining visibility within the community and creating opportunities for informal networking with other influential figures. The financial resources generated by his criminal enterprises, enabled a lifestyle that few African Americans of his generation could afford. But Bumpy was careful to avoid ostentatious displays of wealth that might attract unwanted attention from law enforcement agencies or create resentment within the community. His clothing was elegant but not flashy. His automobiles were well maintained but not exotic, and his entertainment was sophisticated but not extravagant. The goal was to project an image of success and prosperity that inspired respect rather than envy or suspicion. His charitable activities during this period were extensive and carefully planned to maximize their positive impact on community welfare while also strengthening relationships with legitimate institutions and leaders. Regular contributions to churches helped support social programs that served the community's most vulnerable residents, while donations to schools and libraries provided educational resources that would otherwise have been unavailable. These contributions were made both directly and through intermediaries, ensuring that recipients understood the source of the support while maintaining appropriate discretion about the origins of the funds. The relationship between Bumpy and law enforcement during his peak years was characterized by mutual respect and careful adherence to unwritten agreements that allowed both sides to fulfill their essential functions without unnecessary conflict. Police officers understood that his organization maintained order within its territory and cooperated with legitimate investigations when cooperation did not compromise essential business interests. In return, law enforcement agencies focused their attention on more disruptive criminal activities while allowing his relatively peaceful enterprises to operate with minimal interference. This delicate balance was maintained through regular communication between his representatives and appropriate law enforcement officials, ensuring that both sides understood current expectations and limitations. When conflicts did arise, they were typically resolved through negotiation and compromise rather than confrontation, reflecting the mutual recognition that peaceful coexistence served everyone's long term interests better than destructive warfare. By the mid 1930s, Bumpy Johnson had achieved a level of power and influence that was unprecedented for an African American criminal leader in New York City. His organization generated millions of dollars in annual revenue, employed hundreds of people directly and indirectly, and provided services that were valued by thousands of community members who had few alternatives for meeting their economic and security needs. More importantly, he had demonstrated that criminal enterprises could serve positive community functions when they were managed with intelligence, discipline, and genuine concern for community welfare. However, the very success that defined his peak years also created new challenges and vulnerabilities that would soon test his ability to maintain his position in an increasingly complex and dangerous environment. Federal law enforcement agencies were beginning to take greater interest in organized crime activities, while changing social conditions and generational differences within the criminal community were creating pressures that would ultimately challenge the foundations of his carefully constructed empire. The late autumn of 1936 brought with it a melancholy that seemed to permeate even the most successful corners of Harlem, as if the changing light and cooling air carried whispers of the personal sacrifices that accompanied positions of power in the criminal underworld. For Bumpy Johnson, now in his early 30s and at the height of his influence, the shorter days and longer nights provided unwelcome opportunities for reflection on the costs that his chosen path had extracted from his personal life and closest relationships. The empire he had built through intelligence, determination, and careful planning had brought him wealth, respect, and influence beyond what most men of his generation could have imagined, but it had also created barriers between himself and the simple human connections that provided meaning and comfort to those who lived more conventional lives. The most profound of these personal costs was evident in his relationship with his family, particularly his mother, Margaret, who had watched her son's transformation from ambitious young man to feared criminal leader with a mixture of pride and deep concern. She understood that his success had lifted the entire family from the poverty that had defined their early years in both Charleston and Harlem, providing financial security and social status that would have been impossible through legitimate means. Yet she also recognized that his achievements had come at the expense of the dreams she had once held for a son whose intelligence and natural leadership abilities might have led him toward more traditional forms of success. Margaret Johnson had aged considerably during the years of her son's rise to power, the stress of constant worry about his safety and future taking a visible toll on her health and appearance. The gray that had begun to show in her hair during his early criminal activities had now spread throughout, while the lines around her eyes spoke of countless sleepless nights spent wondering whether each day might bring news of his arrest or violent death. She had learned to live with the knowledge that her son's chosen profession made him a target for both law enforcement agencies and rival criminals who might view his elimination as a pathway to their own advancement. The conversations between mother and son had evolved over the years into careful exchanges that acknowledged the realities of his situation while avoiding topics that might cause unnecessary pain or conflict. She no longer asked him to abandon his criminal activities, understanding that such appeals would be both futile and potentially harmful to their relationship. Instead, she focused on encouraging him to be careful, to treat his associates and employees with fairness and respect, and to remember that the money and power he had accumulated were ultimately less important than preserving his life and maintaining his humanity. These conversations typically took place during Sunday dinners at her modest apartment, which she had chosen to keep despite his offers to move her to more luxurious accommodations. The small rooms filled with the aromas of familiar foods served as a sanctuary where both mother and son could temporarily set aside the complexities of his public life and simply enjoy each other's company. Yet even these peaceful interludes were shadowed by the unspoken understanding that each meeting might be their last, a possibility that added poignancy to every shared meal and casual conversation. The isolation that accompanied his position as a criminal leader extended beyond family relationships to affect his ability to form and maintain romantic attachments with women who could understand and accept the realities of his past lifestyle. The danger inherent in his profession made it difficult to involve others in his personal life without exposing them to risks that few people would voluntarily accept. Women who were attracted to his wealth and status often proved unable to cope with the constant uncertainty and potential violence that defined his daily existence, while those who possessed the strength and intelligence to be genuine partners were often unwilling to accept the moral compromises that such relationships required. His romantic relationships during this period were characterized by a pattern of intense but ultimately unsustainable connections with women who were drawn to his charisma and power, but who eventually realized that they could never compete with the demands of his criminal enterprise for his attention and loyalty. These relationships typically began with passionate attraction and mutual fascination, as intelligent and ambitious women found themselves intrigued by a man who had achieved unprecedented success outside the boundaries of conventional society. However, the practical realities of maintaining a romantic relationship with a criminal leader inevitably created strains that proved impossible to overcome. The secrecy required for his personal safety meant that spontaneous activities and public displays of affection were often impossible. The unpredictable nature of his schedule meant that planned activities were frequently canceled or postponed due to business emergencies. Most importantly, the constant possibility of violence or arrest created an atmosphere of tension that made relaxed intimacy extremely difficult to achieve and maintain. The psychological toll of his lifestyle became increasingly apparent during quiet moments when the immediate demands of business leadership temporarily subsided. The need to maintain constant vigilance against potential threats, both external and internal, created a level of stress that affected his sleep patterns, appetite, and general health. He had learned to suppress emotional reactions that might be interpreted as signs of weakness by associates or competitors, but this emotional control came at the cost of spontaneity and genuine self expression that was essential for psychological well being. The paranoia that was necessary for survival in his profession gradually began to affect his ability to trust even his closest associates and longest serving employees. Every conversation was analyzed for hidden meanings, every suggestion was evaluated for potential betrayal, and every new face was assessed as a possible threat to his security or interests. This constant suspicion, while often justified by the realities of criminal life, also prevented him from experiencing the kind of genuine friendship and mutual support that provided comfort and stability to men in less dangerous professions. His periods of imprisonment, which occurred sporadically throughout his career as law enforcement agencies attempted to gather evidence for prosecutions that could withstand judicial scrutiny, provided painful reminders of the freedom he had sacrificed in exchange for power and wealth. The cells in which he was confined during these arrests bore no resemblance to the elegant surroundings of his normal life, while the processed food and rigid schedules of institutional life contrasted sharply with the luxury and flexibility that characterized his usual daily routine. More significantly, these periods of incarceration highlighted the extent to which his identity had become inseparable from his role as a criminal leader. Stripped of the authority and influence that defined his public persona, he was forced to confront questions about who he might have become under different circumstances and what aspects of his character were authentic rather than merely adaptations to the requirements of his chosen profession. These introspective periods were often more challenging than the physical discomforts of imprisonment, as they forced him to acknowledge the aspects of conventional human experience that he had foregone in pursuit of criminal success. The impact of his lifestyle on his physical health became increasingly apparent as the stresses of leadership and the irregular patterns of criminal life took their cumulative toll. The rich foods and expensive alcohol that were part of his social and business activities contributed to weight gain and digestive problems, while the lack of regular exercise and constant tension contributed to high blood pressure and other stress related conditions. The need to present an image of strength and vitality meant that these health problems were often ignored or minimized, creating the potential for more serious medical issues in the future. Sleep, which should have provided respite from the pressures of his waking hours, was frequently disrupted by nightmares that reflected the violence and danger that were constant elements of his professional environment. Even in his most secure locations, surrounded by loyal associates and protected by elaborate security measures. He often found himself awakening in the early morning hours with a sense of unease that made return to peaceful sleep impossible. These disrupted sleep patterns affected his decision making abilities and emotional stability, creating additional challenges for maintaining effective leadership of his complex organization. The philosophical questions that arose from his unique position in society provided another source of ongoing psychological burden. He was acutely aware that his success had been achieved through activities that were considered morally questionable by conventional standards, yet he also recognized that his enterprises provided genuine benefits to his community and employed hundreds of people who might otherwise have struggled to find economic opportunities. This moral ambiguity created internal conflicts that could not be resolved through the practical problem solving skills that served him well in business matters. As the 1930s progressed and his empire continued to grow in size and complexity, these personal costs became increasingly difficult to ignore or rationalize. The success that had once provided satisfaction and motivation began to feel hollow when measured against the human connections and simple pleasures that he had sacrificed in its pursuit. The recognition that his achievements might ultimately prove meaningless if they could not be shared with people who genuinely cared about his welfare rather than his wealth and power created a sense of existential loneliness that no amount of public respect or financial resources could address. The stage was being set for a period of his life when external pressures from law enforcement agencies and rival criminals would combine with these personal struggles to create challenges that would test not only his professional capabilities, but also his fundamental character and resilience. The foundation of personal relationships and psychological stability that should have supported him through these coming trials had been weakened by years of choices that prioritized short term success over long term human fulfillment. The winter of 1937 arrived in Harlem with an unusual severity, bringing temperatures that seemed to freeze not just the streets and sidewalks, but the very air itself, creating an atmosphere of tension and anticipation that experienced residents recognized as the precursor to significant changes in the neighborhood's delicate social balance. The conflict that would define this period and cement Bumpy Johnson's reputation as one of Harlem's most formidable criminal leaders began not with grand declarations or dramatic confrontations, but with a kind of seemingly minor territorial dispute that had been resolved countless times before through negotiation and compromise. Dutch Schultz, whose real name was Arthur Flegenheimer, represented a different breed of criminal entrepreneur than the operators who had previously challenged Bumpy's growing influence in Harlem. Unlike the African American policy kings, who understood the community's social dynamics and cultural sensitivities, Schultz was a white gangster from the Bronx whose approach to illegal enterprise was characterized by brutal efficiency and casual disregard for the communities in which he operated. His organization had built its reputation on violence and intimidation, using methods that prioritized immediate results over long-term relationships or community stability. Schultz's initial interest in Harlem's numbers game was motivated purely by financial considerations, as his associates had calculated that the profits generated by illegal gambling in the neighborhood could support his other criminal enterprises, while also providing a steady source of income that was less vulnerable to law enforcement interference than his bootlegging operations. However, his understanding of the numbers business was superficial, focused on extraction of maximum short-term profits rather than the careful cultivation of customer loyalty and community support that had made the enterprise sustainable for established operators. The first signs of Schultz's intentions became apparent through intelligence reports provided by Bumpy's extensive network of informants who began noticing unfamiliar faces, asking questions about gambling operations, and making inquiries about the organizational structure of established policy banks. These initial reconnaissance activities were conducted with the kind of heavy handed approach that immediately aroused suspicion among Harlem residents, who had learned through experience to be wary of outsiders who displayed too much interest in community business. Bumpy's initial response to these reports was measured and diplomatic, reflecting his preference for resolving conflicts through negotiation rather than violence whenever possible. He arranged for discreet contact with Schultz's representatives, suggesting that any legitimate business interests in Harlem could be accommodated through cooperative arrangements that would benefit all parties while preserving the existing relationships that had brought stability and prosperity to the Pasadena neighborhood's gambling enterprises. However, these diplomatic overtures were rejected with a combination of contempt and threats that made clear Schultz's intention to simply take what he wanted through force rather than negotiating for mutual benefit. His representatives informed Bumpy's emissaries that the Harlem numbers game would soon be operating under new management and that existing operators could either accept subordinate roles in the reorganized enterprise or find themselves eliminated as competitors through whatever means proved necessary. This ultimatum represented a fundamental miscalculation of both Bumpy's character and the loyalty he had cultivated among his associates and throughout the Harlem community. Schultz apparently believed that the same tactics of intimidation and violence that had proven effective in other contexts would be sufficient to cow a criminal organization that he viewed as inherently inferior due to racial prejudices, that blinded him to the sophisticated nature of Bumpy's enterprise and the depth of support it enjoyed among local residents. The crisis escalated rapidly as Schultz's men began implementing their takeover plans through a campaign of systematic intimidation directed at numbers runners, collection agents, and legitimate business owners who provided services to Bumpy's organization. Store proprietors who allowed their establishments to serve as betting locations were visited by threatening strangers who suggested that continued cooperation with existing gambling operations would result in property damage or personal confront harm. Numbers runners were confronted on street corners and warned that persistence in their current employment would have serious consequences for their health and safety. These intimidation tactics represented a serious miscalculation of Harlem's social dynamics and the protective relationships that Bumpy had cultivated throughout the community. Rather than creating the climate of fear that Schultz intended, the threats against local residents generated widespread anger and resentment that strengthened rather than weakened support for existing criminal organizations. Community members who might have remained neutral in a conflict between rival criminal groups found themselves actively supporting Bumpy's organization as the lesser of two evils and the more familiar devil in a situation that required choosing sides. The decisive confrontation occurred on a Thursday evening in late February, when several of Schultz's enforcers attempted to take physical control of one of Harlem's most important policy banks, located in the back room of a legitimate restaurant that had served as a community gathering place for more than a decade. The establishment was owned by an elderly couple who had emigrated from South Carolina during the Great Migration and who had built their business through decades of hard work and careful attention to customer service. The attempted takeover was apparently intended to serve as a demonstration of Schultz's power while also providing his organization with control over a strategic location that could serve as a base for further expansion into one Harlem's gambling market. However, the operation was poorly planned and executed, reflecting the outsider's inadequate understanding of local conditions and social relationships that would have been obvious to anyone with genuine knowledge of the community. The response to this provocation was swift and overwhelming, as members of Bumpy's organization, who had been anticipating such an escalation, were able to mobilize quickly to defend what they viewed as an attack, not just on their economic interests, but on their community's autonomy and dignity. The confrontation that followed would become part of Harlem folklore, though the exact details were known only to those who participated directly in the events of that evening. What seems certain is that Schultz's men found themselves facing not just Bumpy's professional associates, but also community members who viewed the attempted takeover as an unacceptable intrusion by outsiders who had no understanding of or respect for local customs and relationships. The solidarity displayed by Harlem residents during this crisis demonstrated the extent to which Bumpy's organization had become integrated into the community's social fabric rather than remaining an external parasite that it exploited local residents for the benefit of distant criminal enterprises. The aftermath of the February confrontation saw Schultz's organization retreat temporarily while regrouping for what both sides understood would be a more systematic and violent campaign to determine control over Harlem's lucrative gambling operations. Intelligence reports indicated that Schultz was recruiting additional personnel and acquiring weapons for what he apparently intended to be a decisive assault on Bumpy's territorial strongholds throughout northern Manhattan. The preparation for this anticipated escalation required Bumpy to make difficult decisions about the level of violence he was willing to employ in defense of his organization and community. His preference had always been for the minimal use of force necessary to achieve specific objectives, but Schultz's approach made clear that half measures would be interpreted as weakness and would only encourage further aggression that could ultimately prove more destructive than decisive action taken at the appropriate moment. The strategic planning for the coming conflict reflected lessons that Bumpy had learned through years of studying successful military campaigns and business competitions, applying principles of concentration of force, superior intelligence, and psychological warfare that were as relevant to criminal enterprises as they were to conventional warfare. His organization's advantages lay not in superior firepower or numerical strength, but in better knowledge of local conditions, stronger community support, and more sophisticated understanding of the psychological factors that determine success in violent confrontations. The campaign that followed would test every aspect of Bumpy's leadership abilities and organizational capabilities, requiring him to coordinate complex operations while maintaining the loyalty and morale of associates who were risking their lives in defense of principles and relationships that extended beyond simple financial considerations. The conflict also provided opportunities to demonstrate the values and character that distinguished his organization from the kind of predatory criminal enterprise that Schultz represented. The resolution of the crisis came not through a single decisive battle, but through a series of strategic actions that systematically undermined Schultz's position while demonstrating the futility of attempting to impose external control over a community that had unified in opposition to such interference. The campaign revealed both Bumpy's tactical brilliance and his understanding that lasting victory required not just defeating enemies, but also preserving the social relationships and community structures that provided the foundation for long term success. The aftermath of the Schultz conflict established new precedents for how territorial disputes would be resolved in Harlem, while also sending clear messages to other potential challengers about the costs of underestimating either Bumpy's capabilities or the depth of community support for his organization. The crisis had tested every aspect of his criminal empire and had proven its resilience under extreme pressure, but it had also revealed vulnerabilities and created new challenges that would require careful attention in the years ahead. The reputation earned through successful resolution of this conflict would serve Bumpy well in future confrontations, but it would also attract attention from law enforcement agencies and criminal organizations that viewed his demonstrated capabilities as either opportunities for cooperation or threats requiring elimination. The foundation had been laid for the next phase of his career, when external pressures would combine with internal challenges to create tests that would determine whether his organization could adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining the principles that had guided its development from its earliest days. The summer of 1938 brought with it an oppressive heat that seemed to rise from the very concrete of New York City's streets, but for Bumpy Johnson, the physical discomfort of the sweltering weather was nothing compared to the mounting pressure he felt from law enforcement agencies that were beginning to employ new methods and technologies in their efforts to penetrate the sophisticated criminal enterprises that had flourished during the relatively permissive atmosphere of the Prohibition era. The success of his organization and the high-profile nature of his recent conflicts had attracted attention from federal investigators who possessed resources and authority that far exceeded anything available to local police departments. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had undergone significant expansion and modernization under the leadership of J. Edgar Hoover, who had transformed what was once a small and relatively ineffective agency into a powerful instrument of federal law enforcement. The Bureau's new approach emphasized scientific investigation methods, systematic intelligence gathering, and coordinated operations that could span multiple jurisdictions and maintain surveillance for extended periods. These capabilities represented a fundamental shift in the nature of law enforcement that created new challenges for criminal organizations that had previously operated with relative impunity. Bumpy's first indication that federal agents were taking interest in his activities came through his network of informants within local law enforcement agencies, who began reporting questions from unfamiliar investigators who were asking about financial transactions, organizational structures, and specific individuals associated with his various enterprises. These inquiries were conducted with a level of sophistication that distinguished them from the casual corruption that had characterized previous law enforcement interactions, suggesting that federal authorities were conducting systematic investigations rather than simply gathering information for immediate tactical use. The agents involved in these investigations were trained professionals who understood the complexities of organized criminal enterprises and who possessed the patience and resources necessary for long-term surveillance operations. Unlike local police officers who might be corrupted through financial incentives or personal relationships, federal agents operated under strict oversight and were motivated by career advancement opportunities that depended on successful prosecutions of high profile criminal figures. The new investigative methods being employed against his organization included financial analysis techniques that could trace money flows through multiple accounts and businesses, surveillance technologies that allowed agents to monitor activities from considerable distances, and communication intercepts that could reveal the content of supposedly private conversations. These capabilities created vulnerabilities that had not existed during the earlier phases of his criminal career, when law enforcement agencies lacked both the tools and the institutional commitment necessary for sustained investigations of sophisticated criminal enterprises. Bumpy's response to this escalating federal attention required fundamental changes in his organization's operational procedures and security protocols. The casual informality that had characterized many of his business relationships needed to be replaced by more systematic approaches that minimized the creation of documentary evidence and reduced the opportunities for surveillance. Operations to gather useful intelligence. This transition was particularly challenging because it conflicted with his preference for personal relationships and direct communication that had been central to his leadership style. The implementation of enhanced security measures began with comprehensive reviews of all financial transactions and business relationships that might provide federal investigators with evidence of illegal activities or connections between supposedly legitimate businesses and his criminal enterprises. This analysis revealed numerous vulnerabilities that had developed over years of expansion and diversification, creating the need for significant restructuring of both financial systems and organizational hierarchies. Communication procedures were modified to reduce reliance on telephone conversations and written messages that could be intercepted or subpoenaed by federal investigators. Instead, important business discussions were conducted through face to face meetings in carefully selected locations that were regularly changed to prevent the establishment of surveillance patterns. These meetings were often brief and focused on specific issues, with follow up discussions handled through intermediaries who could provide plausible explanations for their presence and activities. The challenge of maintaining effective organizational coordination while minimizing investigative exposure required the development of new management systems that balanced operational efficiency against security concerns. Department heads were given greater autonomy to make routine decisions without consulting with higher levels of authority, reducing the frequency of meetings and communications that might attract federal attention, while also testing the loyalty and competence of subordinates who had previously operated under closer supervision. Financial operations were reorganized to create multiple layers of legitimate businesses that could explain the movement of money without revealing its ultimate sources or destinations. These front operations required careful management to ensure that they generated sufficient legitimate activity to justify their financial transactions while also providing the services necessary for the underlying criminal enterprises. The complexity of these arrangements created new opportunities for errors and betrayals that could compromise the entire organization. The pressure from federal investigations was compounded by changes in local political leadership that reduced the effectiveness of the corruption networks that had previously provided protection from law enforcement interference. Reform minded officials who were less susceptible to financial inducements were replacing corrupt politicians and police administrators who had been willing to ignore illegal gambling and other criminal activities in exchange for attention, regular payments, and political support. These political changes reflected broader shifts in American attitudes toward organized crime and government corruption that were creating a less permissive environment for illegal enterprises. The romantic view of criminal figures that had characterized public opinion during the Prohibition era was being replaced by growing concern about the social costs of organized crime and demands for more effective law enforcement responses to criminal activities. The new political environment also created opportunities for ambitious prosecutors and law enforcement officials who could advance their careers by successfully targeting high profile criminal figures. These officials were often willing to devote significant resources to investigations that previous generations of law enforcement leaders might have considered too expensive or time consuming to justify, creating sustained pressure that was difficult to counter through traditional methods of corruption and intimidation. Media attention represented another source of mounting pressure that complicated Bumpy's efforts to maintain the low profile that had previously protected his organization from unwanted scrutiny. Newspaper reporters and radio journalists were beginning to take greater interest in organized crime stories, particularly those involving colorful figures who could capture public imagination and generate the kind of sensational coverage that sold newspapers and attracted radio audiences. This media attention created a feedback loop that intensified law enforcement pressure by making criminal figures into public symbols that prosecutors and politicians could target to demonstrate their commitment to fighting organized crime. High profile prosecutions became opportunities for career advancement and political positioning that made it difficult for corrupt officials to ignore illegal activities that had previously been tolerated or overlooked. The technological advances that were transforming American society during the late 1930s also created new challenges for criminal organizations that had developed their procedures during earlier technological eras. Improved photography allowed law enforcement agencies to document activities and relationships that had previously been difficult to prove in court. Enhanced communication systems enabled better coordination between different law enforcement agencies and faster response times to criminal activities. Banking regulations and reporting requirements were becoming more sophisticated, creating paper trails that could be analyzed by federal investigators with accounting expertise and subpoena powers that extended far beyond the capabilities of local police departments. These regulatory changes made it increasingly difficult to move large amounts of money without creating evidence that could be used in criminal prosecutions. The cumulative effect of these various pressures was to create an environment that was fundamentally different from the one in which Bumpy's organization had developed and flourished. The relatively stable relationships with corrupt officials, the predictable patterns of law enforcement activity, and the limited investigative capabilities that had characterized the earlier criminal environment were being replaced by more dynamic and sophisticated opposition that required constant adaptation and vigilance. As the summer of 1938 progressed into autumn, it became increasingly apparent that the golden age of criminal enterprise in Harlem was drawing to a close. The combination of federal attention, political reform, technological advancement, and media scrutiny was creating a new paradigm for law enforcement that would require fundamental changes in how criminal organizations operated if they hoped to survive and prosper in the years ahead. The challenge facing Bumpy was not simply to adapt to these new conditions, but to do so while maintaining the loyalty of associates who had joined his organization during more permissive times and who might not be willing or able to accept the restrictions and risks that the new environment required. The foundation that had supported his rise to power was shifting beneath his feet, requiring him to rebuild his empire on new principles while surrounded by enemies who possessed resources and capabilities that previous generations of criminals had never been forced to confront. The stage was being set for the final phase of his criminal career, when the pressures that had been building throughout the late 1930s would combine with internal organizational challenges to create a crisis that would test every aspect of his leadership abilities and determine whether the empire he had built through intelligence and determination could survive in a world that no longer tolerated the kinds of criminal enterprises that had once flourished in the shadows of American urban life. The autumn of 1941 brought with it a sense of unease that seemed to permeate every conversation and cast shadows over even the most routine business interactions within Bumpy Johnson's organization. The mounting pressure from federal investigations had created an atmosphere of suspicion and paranoia that was gradually undermining the personal relationships and mutual trust that had served as the foundation for his criminal enterprise. Throughout its years of growth and prosperity, the bonds of loyalty that had once seemed unbreakable were beginning to show signs of strain as associates and employees faced difficult choices between personal survival and organizational solidarity in an environment where betrayal might offer the only path to avoiding lengthy prison sentences. The erosion of trust within the organization began subtly, manifesting in small changes in behavior and communication patterns that might have gone unnoticed in less stressful circumstances. Conversations that had once been open and candid became more guarded and formal, with participants carefully weighing their words to avoid creating statements that might be misinterpreted or used against them in future legal proceedings. The casual informality that had characterized interactions between different levels of the organizational hierarchy gave way to more structured and distant relationships that reflected growing concern about surveillance and infiltration by IMNED, law enforcement agents. These changes were most apparent among the younger members of the organization who had joined during its expansion phase and who lacked the deep personal connections to Bumpy and his closest associates that might have provided stronger motivation for maintaining loyalty under pressure. Unlike the veterans who had shared the risks and rewards of building the enterprise from its early days, these newer recruits viewed their involvement primarily as employment rather than as participation in a shared venture that demanded personal sacrifice for collective benefit. The Federal Bureau of Investigation's sophisticated approach to investigating organized crime had created incentives for cooperation that were fundamentally different from the crude intimidation tactics that local law enforcement agencies had traditionally employed. Rather than simply threatening immediate arrest and prosecution, federal agents offered carefully structured plea agreements that could reduce charges significantly for individuals who were willing to provide information about organizational structures, financial operations, and the activities of higher ranking criminals. These plea agreements were particularly attractive to lower level employees who faced the prospect of serving substantial prison sentences for relatively minor roles in the organization's activities. A numbers runner who might receive 5 to 10 years in federal prison for gambling related charges could potentially avoid incarceration entirely by providing information about collection procedures, customer lists, and the identity of supervisory personnel who made decisions about operational matters. The psychological pressure created by these prosecutorial tactics was compounded by the increasing isolation that federal investigations imposed on criminal organizations. The enhanced surveillance capabilities and communication intercepts that law enforcement agencies were employing made it dangerous for organization members to maintain the kind of regular contact and mutual support that had previously helped them cope with the stresses of criminal life. Associates who had once provided emotional support and practical assistance to each other were forced to limit their interactions to essential business matters, creating a sense of abandonment that made betrayal seem more acceptable. Bumpy's recognition of these developing problems led him to implement additional security measures that were intended to identify potential informants before they could cause serious damage to the organization. However, these measures themselves contributed to the atmosphere of suspicion and distrust that was undermining organizational cohesion. Background investigations of longtime associates, electronic sweeps for surveillance devices, and restrictions on communication methods created an environment that felt more like a military organization under siege than the relatively relaxed criminal enterprise that had characterized his operation during its peak years. The first significant betrayal occurred in late 1941 when Illinois Gordon, who had been one of Bumpy's most trusted lieutenants since the early days of organizational development, was arrested by federal agents who clearly possessed detailed information about his activities and financial arrangements. The circumstances of his arrest suggested that investigators had been monitoring his movements for an extended period, tracking his meetings and documenting his role in coordinating operations across multiple neighborhoods in northern Harlem. Gordon's subsequent cooperation with federal prosecutors came as a devastating blow to Bumpy's confidence in his ability to maintain organizational loyalty through the traditional methods of personal relationship building and shared financial benefit. Gordon had been more than simply an employee. He had been a friend and confidant whose judgment had been relied upon for important strategic decisions and whose loyalty had never been questioned despite numerous opportunities for betrayal during previous law enforcement investigations. The information that Gordon provided to federal prosecutors apparently included detailed descriptions of organizational procedures, financial record keeping systems, and the roles played by specific individuals in coordinating illegal gambling operations. This intelligence gave law enforcement agencies the kind of insider knowledge that had previously been impossible to obtain without placing undercover agents within the organization, a tactic that had been difficult to implement successfully due to the close personal relationships that characterized recruitment and advancement within Bumpy's enterprise. The impact of Gordon's betrayal extended far beyond the immediate legal consequences for those individuals who were implicated in his revelations. The knowledge that such a trusted associate had been willing to cooperate with federal authorities created doubt and suspicion that affected every relationship within the organization, making it difficult for even longtime associates to interact with complete confidence in each other's loyalty and discretion. The investigation that followed Gordon's cooperation revealed additional vulnerabilities within the organization that suggested other potential sources of information for law enforcement agencies. Financial records that had been considered secure were apparently accessible to federal subpoenas, while communication methods that had been thought to be private were revealed to be subject to various forms of surveillance and intercept. These discoveries forced Bumpy to acknowledge that his organization had been penetrated more deeply than he had previously realized. The response to these revelations required a comprehensive reorganization of operational procedures that was both disruptive and demoralizing for associates who had grown accustomed to established patterns of authority and communication. Longtime employees found themselves subjected to increased scrutiny and reduced access to sensitive information, while new security protocols made routine business operations more complex and time consuming than they had been during the organization's peak period of efficiency and profitability. The psychological toll of this constant suspicion and reorganization was particularly evident among middle management personnel who found themselves caught between their loyalty to Bumpy and their responsibility for subordinates who propalation might be facing their own decisions about cooperation with law enforcement agencies. These individuals were forced to balance the need to maintain operational effectiveness against the requirement to limit their exposure to potential prosecution and as dust, creating internal conflicts that affected both their personal well being and their professional performance. The broader changes occurring within American society during the early 1940s also contributed to the breakdown of traditional relationships within criminal organizations. The country's preparation for potential involvement in World War II had created new opportunities for legitimate employment that made criminal activities less attractive to young men who might previously have viewed illegal enterprises as their best hope for economic advancement. The social solidarity that had characterized many urban neighborhoods during the Great Depression was beginning to give way to more individualistic attitudes that made personal loyalty less important than immediate self interest. These social changes were particularly apparent among the newest generation of potential recruits who displayed attitudes toward authority and organizational commitment that differed significantly from those of their predecessors. Young men who came of age during the late 1930s and early 1940s were more likely to view criminal organizations as temporary employment opportunities rather than as long term career commitments that demanded personal sacrifice and absolute loyalty. The cumulative effect of betrayals, investigations, and social changes was to create an environment in which maintaining an effective criminal organization became increasingly difficult and expensive. The security measures necessary to prevent infiltration and betrayal reduced operational efficiency while increasing overhead costs, while the constant turnover of personnel made it difficult to maintain the institutional knowledge and relationships that had been essential for success during earlier periods. As 1942 began, Bumpy found himself managing an organization that bore little resemblance to the cohesive and efficient enterprise that had dominated Harlem's illegal gambling market during the 1930s. The trust and mutual confidence that had once enabled rapid decision making and coordinated action had been replaced by suspicion and caution that slowed every aspect of organizational activity while creating new opportunities for soap, mistakes, and misunderstandings that could provide additional evidence for law enforcement investigations. The recognition that his organizational model might no longer be viable in the changed law enforcement environment forced Bumpy to consider fundamental questions about the future direction of his criminal career. The empire that he had built through careful attention to personal relationships and community integration was being systematically undermined by forces that seemed beyond his ability to control or counter through traditional methods of procession, criminal leadership. The foundation was being laid for the final phase of his criminal career when external pressures and internal betrayals would combine to create challenges that would test not only his tactical abilities, but also his capacity to adapt to a fundamentally changed environment in which the rules of criminal enterprise had been altered by forces that extended far beyond the boundaries of Harlem's streets and criminal underworld. The spring of 1945 arrived in Harlem with a subdued quality that seemed to reflect the neighborhood's recognition that an era was ending, not just in the broader world where global warfare was finally drawing to a close, but in the intimate geography of streets and buildings where Bumpy Johnson had exercised influence for more than 2 decades. The cherry trees that bloomed along the wider avenues carried the same delicate pink blossoms that had marked the changing seasons throughout his rise to power, but the world around them had been fundamentally altered by forces that extended far beyond any individual's ability to control or direct. Bumpy himself, now approaching his 40th birthday, had begun to show the accumulated effects of more than 20 years spent navigating the dangerous currents of criminal enterprise in one of America's most competitive and unforgiving environments. The sharp intelligence and quick reflexes that had served him so well during his younger years remained intact, but they were now tempered by a weariness that came from understanding how much the world had changed around him and how limited his options had become for adapting to those changes. The criminal organization that had once commanded respect and fear throughout northern Manhattan had been reduced to a shadow of its former self through the combined effects of federal investigations, organizational betrayals, and the broader social transformations that were reshaping American urban life in the aftermath of the war. Many of his most trusted associates were either serving federal prison sentences or had withdrawn from criminal activities to pursue the legitimate opportunities that wartime economic expansion had made available to men with intelligence and organizational skills. The numbers game that had formed the foundation of his empire was still operating, but under conditions that made it far less profitable and much more dangerous than it had been during the halcyon days of the 1930s. Enhanced law enforcement capabilities, improved intelligence gathering techniques, and more sophisticated prosecution strategies had created an environment in which even minor gambling violations could result in serious federal charges that carried sentences measured in years rather than months. The community relationships that had once provided both protection and legitimacy for his activities had also evolved in ways that reduced their effectiveness as sources of support and concealment. The residents of Harlem who had once viewed illegal gambling as a necessary evil or even a positive force in their neighborhood's economic life were increasingly attracted to legitimate forms of entertainment and investment that offered similar excitement without the legal risks and moral complications associated with criminal enterprises. The legitimate businesses that had served as fronts for his illegal activities were finding it increasingly difficult to maintain the delicate balance between profitability and plausible deniability that had once made them effective. Components of his organizational structure, enhanced banking regulations, and more sophisticated financial investigation techniques had made it nearly impossible to move large amounts of money through legitimate channels without creating documentary evidence that could be used in this criminal prosecutions. The political and law enforcement environment that had enabled his rise to power had been replaced by a more professional and less corruptible system that was resistant to the traditional methods of influence and protection that had once shielded criminal organizations from unwanted interference. Reform-minded officials who were motivated by career advancement rather than financial gain had little interest in maintaining the accommodation with organized crime that had characterized earlier generations of public servants. The personal costs of maintaining his position in this changed environment had become increasingly difficult to justify, even to himself. The constant vigilance required to avoid law enforcement surveillance had made normal social relationships virtually impossible, while the security measures necessary to prevent betrayal by associates had created an atmosphere of isolation and suspicion that drained much of the satisfaction from his professional achievements. His relationship with his aging mother had become a source of particular anguish during this period, as he struggled to balance his desire to spend time with her against his recognition that such contact might expose her to dangers that she had done nothing to deserve. Margaret Johnson, now in her 70s and suffering from the various ailments that afflicted many people of her generation, represented the last connection to his pre criminal life and the values that had shaped his early development. The conversations they shared during her final years were characterized by an unspoken understanding that both mother and son were aware of how their relationship had been shaped by choices made decades earlier. She no longer asked him about his work or expressed hopes for his eventual reformation, but rather focused on reminiscences about their early years together and expressions of love that transcended any disapproval she might have felt about the path his life had taken. Her death in the winter of 1946 removed the last external motivation for maintaining the pretense that his criminal career was serving any purpose beyond simple inertia and pride. The funeral service, conducted in the same Baptist church where she had worshiped for more than 25 years, was attended by hundreds of Harlem residents who came to pay their respects to a woman who had been regarded as a pillar of her community despite the notoriety of her son's activities. The period following his mother's death was marked by a profound reassessment of priorities and possibilities that would have seemed impossible during the years when his organization was expanding and his influence was growing. For the first time since his teenage years, Bumpy began to seriously consider the possibility of withdrawing from criminal activities and attempting to build a life based on different principles and objectives. The practical challenges involved in such a transition were formidable, given his age, his criminal record, and his lack of experience in legitimate business activities. However, the psychological appeal of escaping from the constant stress and danger that defined his current existence was strong enough to motivate serious exploration of alternatives that might have seemed unrealistic under different reverent circumstances. The legitimate business interests that he had developed during the peak years of his criminal career provided potential foundations for a legal livelihood, though they would need to be restructured and expanded to generate sufficient income to support the lifestyle to which he had become accustomed. More importantly, they would need to be completely separated from any connection to illegal activities if they were to serve as the basis for a new and legally defensible way of life. The process of disengaging from criminal activities while maintaining his personal safety and financial security required careful planning and gradual implementation over several years. Associates who had served him loyally needed to be provided with alternative arrangements that would protect them from retaliation by rivals who might view Bumpy's withdrawal as an opportunity for territorial expansion. Debts and obligations that had accumulated during decades of criminal enterprise needed to be resolved in ways that would not create ongoing sources of conflict or legal exposure. The transformation from criminal leader to private citizen also required fundamental changes in daily routines, social relationships, and personal habits that had been shaped by decades of life outside the boundaries of conventional society. The hypervigilance that had been necessary for survival in the criminal underworld needed to be gradually relaxed, while new patterns of social interaction needed to be developed that were appropriate for someone seeking to live within the boundaries of legal society. By the early 1950s, Bumpy had largely succeeded in extricating himself from active participation in criminal enterprises while maintaining enough residual influence to protect his interests and ensure his personal safety. The organization that had once been one of Harlem's most powerful criminal forces had been dissolved or transferred to other operators, while the territorial boundaries that had been established through decades of negotiation and conflict had been restructured to accommodate new leadership and changed circumstances. The public recognition that had once made him one of Harlem's most visible and controversial figures gradually gave way to a more private existence that allowed him to move through the neighborhood without attracting the attention that had once accompanied his every appearance. The respect that he continued to command was now based on his reputation as a former power broker rather than his current activities, creating a form of retirement that was both peaceful and dignified. The man who had once commanded an empire that generated millions of dollars in annual revenue and employed hundreds of people directly and indirectly had become something approaching a neighborhood elder statesman, consulted occasionally for his wisdom and experience, but no longer actively involved in the day-to-day operations of criminal enterprises. The transformation represented both a personal victory over the forces that had threatened to destroy him and a recognition that survival sometimes required acceptance of limitations that might once have seemed unthinkable. As the 1950s progressed, and Harlem continued to evolve in response to broader social and economic changes, Bumpy Johnson settled into a role that combined elements of respected retiree and legendary figure whose stories would be told and retold by successive generations of residents who had witnessed or heard about the golden age of criminal and enterprise in their neighborhood. The reckoning that he had long anticipated had finally arrived, but it had taken the form of gradual adaptation rather than dramatic confrontation, allowing him to survive the transition from one era to another with his dignity and much of his influence intact. The morning of July 7th, 1968, dawned clear and warm over Harlem, with a kind of golden sunlight that seemed to illuminate every brick and window of the neighborhood's towering apartment buildings and elegant brownstones. It was on this summer day that Bumpy Johnson, now 62 years old and enjoying what appeared to be a peaceful retirement from his former life as one of America's most influential criminal leaders, would take his final walk through the streets that had been his kingdom for more than 4 decades. His death that evening, reportedly from a heart attack while dining at a restaurant near his home, marked the end of an era not just for Harlem, but for organized crime throughout the United States. The funeral that followed drew thousands of mourners to the streets of Harlem, creating scenes that would have been remarkable for any community leader, but were particularly striking for a man whose career had been built on illegal activities that many residents had once viewed with suspicion or disapproval. The procession that followed his casket from the funeral home to the cemetery included not only his family and close associates, but also legitimate business owners, community activists, church leaders, and ordinary residents who had come to pay their respects to a man they remembered as much for his contributions to their neighborhood as for his criminal activities. This outpouring of public grief and respect reflected the complex legacy that Bumpy had created through decades of balancing his role as a criminal entrepreneur with his position as an informal community leader and benefactor. Unlike many organized crime figures who were viewed by their communities as parasites or predators, Bumpy had managed to maintain genuine popularity and affection among many Harlem residents who recognized that his activities had provided both economic opportunities and community stability during periods when legitimate institutions had failed to meet their needs. The economic impact of his criminal enterprises had extended far beyond the immediate profits generated by illegal gambling and other activities. His organization had provided employment for hundreds of people over the years, offering opportunities for advancement and financial security to individuals who might otherwise have struggled to find stable work in an economy that systematically discriminated against African American workers. The protection services that his organization had provided had helped legitimate businesses flourish by reducing the criminal predation that might otherwise have made commercial activity too risky to sustain. The charitable activities that had characterized his approach to community relations had left lasting marks on Harlem's social and cultural institutions. Churches that had received his financial support had been able to expand their social service programs and maintain their buildings during periods of economic hardship. Schools and libraries that had benefited from his contributions had been able to provide educational resources that would not otherwise have been available to neighborhood children. These investments in community infrastructure had created benefits that extended far beyond his lifetime and influenced the development of successive generations of Harlem residents. Perhaps most significantly, Bumpy's career had demonstrated that African American criminal organizations could achieve levels of sophistication and influence that had previously been associated primarily with Italian American organized crime families. His success had shown that intelligence, organizational skills, and strategic thinking could enable minority entrepreneurs to compete successfully in illegal markets that had once been dominated by other ethnic groups. This example had inspired other African American criminals to pursue more ambitious and sophisticated criminal enterprises rather than limiting themselves to the small scale street crime that had characterized much of black criminal activity during earlier periods. The methods that Bumpy had developed for managing criminal organizations had influenced the evolution of organized crime throughout the United States. His emphasis on community relations, political corruption, and legitimate business fronts had provided a model that was subsequently adopted by criminal organizations in other cities and ethnic communities. The integration of illegal enterprises with legitimate businesses that had characterized his approach had become a standard feature of sophisticated criminal operations by the time of his death. His approach to violence had also left a lasting impact on criminal organizational culture. Unlike many criminal leaders who used violence primarily as a tool of intimidation or revenge, Bumpy had demonstrated that force could be employed strategically to achieve specific objectives while minimizing the kind of public attention that attracted unwanted law enforcement scrutiny. This more calculated approach to violence had influenced criminal organizations that sought to maintain low profiles while building sustainable illegal enterprises. The corruption networks that he had developed had provided templates for subsequent criminal organizations seeking to establish protective relationships with law enforcement and political figures. His methods for identifying corruptible officials, building long-term relationships, and maintaining discreet financial arrangements had been studied and emulated by criminal leaders throughout the country who recognized the value of political protection for illegal enterprises. The cultural impact of his career extended beyond the criminal underworld into broader American popular culture, where his story became part of the mythology surrounding organized crime and urban life. The combination of criminal success and community involvement that had characterized his career provided material for countless stories, books, and eventually films that portrayed him as a complex figure who defied simple categorization as either hero or villain. His influence on popular perceptions of African American criminality was particularly significant, as his story provided an alternative to the stereotypical images of black criminals as unsophisticated street thugs who lacked the intelligence and organizational skills necessary for major criminal enterprises. The respect that he had commanded from both criminal associates and community members had demonstrated that African American criminals could achieve the same levels of power and influence that had been associated with organized crime. Figures from other ethnic backgrounds. The timing of his death, coming at the height of the civil rights movement and during a period of significant social upheaval in American cities, added symbolic weight to his passing. Many observers viewed his career as representing a form of black empowerment that had operated outside the boundaries of legal, political activism, but had nonetheless demonstrated African American capabilities for leadership and organization that challenged prevailing racial stereotypes. The criminal organizations that emerged in Harlem after his death reflected both his influence and the changed conditions that characterized urban crime during the late 1960s and early 1970s. Younger criminals who had observed his methods attempted to build their own enterprises using similar techniques, though they operated in an environment that was less permissive of organized criminal activity and more heavily policed than the one in which Bumpy had achieved his success. The drug trade that began to dominate urban criminal activity during the 1970s represented both a continuation and a departure from the model that Bumpy had established. Like his gambling operations, drug trafficking required sophisticated organizational structures and community relationships to operate successfully. However, the violence and social disruption associated with drug trafficking were far more extensive than what had characterized the relatively peaceful gambling enterprises that had been Bumpy's specialty. Frank Lucas, who claimed to have been influenced by Bumpy's example and methods, represented one of the most prominent attempts to apply his organizational principles to drug trafficking. Lucas's emphasis on controlling supply chains, maintaining quality control, and building customer loyalty reflected lessons that could be traced directly to Bumpy's approach to illegal gambling, though the social costs of drug trafficking made such enterprises far more destructive to community welfare than gambling had ever been. The law enforcement techniques that had eventually limited Bumpy's activities and forced his retirement from active criminality became standard tools for investigating organized crime throughout the United States. The federal approach to criminal investigation that had been developed during his career provided the foundation for subsequent efforts to combat organized crime, corporate fraud, and other sophisticated criminal enterprises that required long term investigation and coordination between different law enforcement agencies. Academic studies of organized crime that emerged during the decades following his death often cited his career as an example of how criminal enterprises could achieve legitimacy and community support through careful attention to local community needs and relationships. Sociologists and criminologists who studied the relationship between crime and community found in his story evidence for theories about the social functions served by certain types of illegal activities in communities that were underserved. By legitimate institutions, the neighborhood that had been the center of his criminal empire continued to evolve long after his death, influenced by broader social and economic changes that transformed urban America during the latter half of the 20th century. However, the institutional relationships and community networks that he had helped to establish provided some stability during periods of rapid change, demonstrating the lasting impact that thoughtful criminal leadership could have on community development. As the 21st century dawned and American society continued to grapple with questions of race, crime, and urban development, the story of Bumpy Johnson remained relevant as an example of how individual agency and organizational skill could create lasting change even within the constraints of illegal activity. His legacy served as a reminder that the boundaries between legitimate and illegitimate power were often more fluid than conventional analysis suggested, and that understanding American urban history required acknowledgement of the complex roles that criminal organizations had played in community development and social change.